The trading post sat like a weathered sentinel at the crossroads of nowhere and forgotten, its adobe walls the color of dried blood in the late afternoon sun. It was 1993, and while the rest of the world rushed headlong into the future, this corner of the Navajo Nation seemed to exist in a permanent state of twilight, caught between the old ways and the new. I stood in the dim back room, breathing in the pungent mixture of old leather, dust, and something deeper, something that spoke of generations of stories traded across worn wooden counters. My name is Joshua Treehorn, and I'd spent the last decade drifting between odd jobs across the Southwest, each one taking me further from who I used to be. The woman behind the counter, Loretta, according to her name tag, sized me up with the kind of careful scrutiny that came from years of separating truth from lies, in a place where both were traded as freely as turquoise and silver. "You any good with horses, Mr. Treehorn?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight rasp of too many cigarettes and too many years of desert wind. "One of the best," I assured her, ignoring the twinge of guilt at the slight exaggeration. It had been years since I'd sat properly in a saddle, but desperation has a way of making you remember skills you'd rather forget. The reservation was suffering through its third year of drought, and work was as scarce as rain. Loretta's eyes narrowed, reading something in my face that I thought I'd hidden better. "Got a fellow who might take you on," she said slowly, "but he's particular. Needs someone who can handle the quiet." "You a talker, Mr. Treehorn?" A ghost of a smile crossed my lips. I've been known to spin a yarn or two. The truth was, I'd learned the value of silence in my years alone. Sometimes the stories you don't tell are the ones that keep you alive. That seemed to satisfy her. She scribbled an address on a crumpled receipt, her handwriting as jagged as the mesas that dominated the horizon. "Head north towards Shiprock. He's about 10 miles out. Big old white ranch house, got a horse barn behind it. Name's Walter Duncan." She paused, something flickering behind her eyes. "Tell him Loretta sent you." I'd heard whispers about Walter Duncan in the bars and cafes that dotted the reservation like lonely stars. They said he was touched by something out there in the vastness, that he talked to his horses more than people, that he kept loaded rifles by every window of his house. Some said he'd seen things out in the desert that had turned his hair white overnight. Perfect. When you're running from your own shadows, sometimes the best place to hide is in someone else's darkness. The sun was beginning its slow descent as I guided my battered Ford pickup along the rutted dirt road that led to Duncan's ranch. The land out here was different from the tourist-friendly vistas closer to town. Here, the desert showed its teeth-raw red cliffs jutting up like broken bones, sparse vegetation clinging to life with stubborn determination. The silence was absolute, broken only by the labored breathing of my truck's engine and the occasional cry of a hunting hawk. As I crested a rise, the Duncan Ranch spread out before me like a mirage. It was bigger than I'd expected, at least 1,000 acres, maybe more. A sprawling white ranch house dominated the property, its paint peeling in the relentless sun. Behind it, a massive barn listed slightly to one side, as if bearing the weight of untold secrets. But it was the horses that caught my attention first. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, scattered across the pastures like dark chess pieces on a board of burnt grass. They were beautiful animals, mostly quarter horses from what I could tell, but something about their behavior set off warning bells in my mind. They moved restlessly, clustered together in tight groups, their heads up and nostrils flaring. These weren't the lazy, sun-drowsed horses you'd expect to see on a late afternoon. These animals were afraid. Walter Duncan was waiting for me on the porch, a tall, lean figure silhouetted against the dying light. He didn't move as I parked and stepped out of my truck, didn't offer any greeting or gesture of welcome. He just watched, still as a rattler before the strike, as I approached the house. "Mr. Duncan? Loretta at the trading post sent me. I'm Joshua Treehorn, here about the work." He studied me for a long moment, his face weathered as old leather, eyes the pale blue of winter sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "You believe in things you can't see, Mr. Treehorn?" It wasn't the opening question I'd expected from a potential employer, but years of living on the reservation had taught me to respect the roundabout way conversations sometimes needed to unfold. The old stories? I shrugged. Some truth in them, I suppose. Spirits, skinwalkers maybe. Duncan's eyes narrowed, and I saw something flash across his face. Relief? Recognition? Not stories, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Things, out there in the darkness, things that don't follow the rules. He turned abruptly and pushed open the heavy wooden door, gesturing for me to follow him inside. The interior of the ranch house was like stepping into another world, or perhaps another time. Taxidermied animals lined the walls, their glass eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight that filtered through dusty windows. The air hummed with a low, persistent buzz I couldn't quite place, and the smell, something beyond the expected musty scent of an old house. Something metallic, almost electric. Duncan pointed to a worn leather armchair and waited until I sat before he began to pace, his boots making no sound on the thick Persian rug that covered most of the floor. Something's been at my herd, he said without preamble. Killing horses, not for food, for sport, almost seems. He stopped pacing suddenly, fixing me with that pale, intense gaze. The thing out there, it's not right, not natural. I felt my heart begin to thud against my ribs, though I couldn't have said exactly why. This was why folks kept their distance from Walter Duncan. The man wasn't just odd, he was touched, as the elders would say. I chose my next words carefully. Look, whatever's bothering your horses, maybe it's a mountain lion. Maybe coyotes got too big for their britches. I'm a decent enough tracker, can help you find it, put it down. But Duncan wasn't listening anymore. His focus had shifted, his entire body going rigid as he stared at a point over my shoulder. Following his gaze, I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, framed in the doorway leading to the kitchen, stood the largest, blackest dog I'd ever seen. Its eyes burned like embers in the gathering darkness, and a low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than any earthly creature's throat. But what froze me in place wasn't its size or its eyes. It was the shape of it, the way it moved. Wrong somehow, as if its body was assembled from parts that didn't quite fit together. You see it, don't you? Walter's voice was a hoarse whisper. It's here, right now. I nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this house and this man and whatever hell-spawned thing stood before us. But some deeper part of me, a part that echoed with the old stories of my ancestors, kept me rooted in place. The dog thing took a step forward, its guttural growl escalating into something that made my teeth ache. It didn't move like a normal dog, its limbs too long, its joints bending at impossible angles. Walter reached under an end table, pulling out an old lever-action rifle with the smooth motion of long practice. Can you shoot? His voice was eerily calm now. You bet, I said, surprised to find my own voice steady. Then we might just survive the night, he said grimly, raising the rifle. Thing is, bullets might not be enough. I took a steadying breath. I didn't know if I believed in monsters, but I believed in what I was seeing. And something told me this wouldn't be some simple hunt. This was something older, something that walked the line between the world I knew and the one I'd spent my life trying to ignore. The dog thing snarled and lunged, a blur of darkness and teeth. The night had only just begun. The creature moved with impossible speed, dodging Walter's first shot like it knew exactly where the bullet would go. The sound of the rifle blast echoed off the walls, momentarily drowning out the beast's growl. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, mixing with an older, fouler stench that seemed to emanate from the thing itself. Like wet fur and rotting meat and something else, something that had no name in any human language. As Walter chambered another round, my mind flashed back to the last time I'd faced death. It was 5 years ago, up in the Chusca Mountains, when a routine hiking trip had gone sideways. I'd been leading a group of tourists, rich folks from back east who wanted to experience the real Southwest. The memory hit me with crystalline clarity, even as I dove behind an overturned table. "The legs!" Walter shouted, snapping me back to the present. "Aim for its legs!" The creature had leaped onto his kitchen table, sending decades-old china crashing to the floor. In the dim light, its form seemed to shift and flow like smoke, but there was nothing insubstantial about the claws that left deep gouges in the wood. I'd started guiding tours after my father passed, using the skills he'd taught me about the land, the tracking, the survival techniques that had been passed down through generations. Dad had been one of the last true horsemen of the old school, equally comfortable in the saddle or reading weather patterns in the dawn sky. He'd tried to teach me everything he knew, but I'd been too eager to leave, too convinced that the modern world had more to offer than ancient wisdom and patient observation. The creature's claws raked across my shoulder, tearing through my jacket like it was tissue paper. The pain was immediate and intense, but different from any animal attack I'd experienced. It burned like ice, a cold so severe it felt like fire. "Joshua!" Walter's voice carried a note of desperate command. "The fireplace, remember what I told you? What he told me?" My thoughts were scattered, fragmented by pain and fear. Then it hit me, the old stories. The ones my grandmother used to tell around the fire on winter nights, when the wind howled outside like a hungry thing seeking entrance. Stories of creatures that could only be destroyed by flame. The fireplace was maybe 15 feet away, an ancient stone hearth that looked like it had been here since the house was built. A few embers still glowed weakly among the ashes. Walter had mentioned matches earlier, but where? The beast lunged again, and this time Walter met it with the butt of his rifle, a solid crack that would have killed any normal animal. The creature barely seemed to notice. Its eyes, God, its eyes. They weren't just red now. They were changing, shifting through colors that shouldn't exist. "Your pocket," Walter grunted, struggling to keep the thing at bay. "Left them in your pocket." He was right. The box of matches was there, the weight of it suddenly the most important thing in the world. But as I pulled them out, another memory surfaced, this one darker, more recent. The real reason I'd left the guiding business, the real reason I'd been drifting from job to job across the reservation. It had been a cave up near Canyon de Chelly, a simple day hike, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. But something had been different that day. The shadows had been deeper, the silence more complete, and there had been tracks in the dust, tracks that made no sense, that seemed to start and stop at random, that belonged to nothing I'd ever seen in all my years in the wilderness. "Now, Joshua!" Walter's voice cracked with urgency. "It has to be now!" I struck the first match with trembling fingers, watching the small flame spring to life. The creature's head snapped toward me, nostrils flaring. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in those impossible eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. The memory of the cave crashed over me again. The tracks had led deeper and I'd followed them, ignoring every instinct that screamed at me to turn back. My clients had waited at the entrance, but I'd had to know, had to see. And in the deepest chamber, in darkness so complete it seemed alive, I'd found something that had changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The match burned my fingers, jolting me back to reality. The creature was coiling itself, preparing to spring. Walter had positioned himself between us, but his rifle was empty now, useful only as a club. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat lasting an eternity. I struck another match, then another, dropping them into the fireplace where small tongues of flame began to lick at the old wood. The creature watched, its form seeming to ripple and distort. Was it larger now? The shadows it cast on the wall certainly were, stretching and twisting into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. "The sage!" Walter shouted. "On the mantel!" A small bundle of dried sage lay there, wrapped in red thread. I grabbed it, tossing it into the growing flames. The effect was immediate. A sharp, clean smell cut through the creature's foul stench, and it let out a sound that was almost human in its anguish. That sound. I'd heard it before, in that cave 5 years ago. The same otherworldly howl that had sent me running in blind panic, leaving behind... what? I still couldn't remember exactly what I'd seen that day. My mind had blocked it out, the same way it blocks out trauma too terrible to process. The fire was roaring now, and Walter was backing slowly toward me, his eyes never leaving the creature. "You remember now, don't you?" he asked softly. "Remember what they really are?" I did. My grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of beings that walked between worlds, that wore darkness like a second skin. The Navajo had many names for them, but one in particular rang in my mind: Yi Nald Lushi, Skinwalker. But this was something else, something older. The fire cast wild shadows across its form as it paced before us, and in those shadows I caught glimpses of what it really was, something that had never been human, had never even been animal, something that had existed in the dark spaces of the world since before there were words to name it. "The adversary," Walter whispered, and the creature's head snapped up at the word, its entire form seeming to vibrate with hatred. "The old ones knew. They left warnings, if you know where to look. The cave. The memories were coming faster now. The petroglyphs I'd found deep inside, ancient drawings that depicted this exact creature, locked in eternal battle with figures wielding fire. How long had it been here, haunting these lands? How many others had encountered it over the centuries? The fire was at full blaze now, and I could feel its heat on my face. The creature had backed away slightly, but it wasn't retreating. It was gathering itself for one final attack. In its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was utterly alien, yet terrifyingly aware. It knew us, knew our kind, had known us for longer than we had known ourselves. Walter pressed something into my hand, a small pouch that smelled of herbs and something metallic. "When it comes," he said, his voice steady despite everything, "throw this into the fire, and whatever happens next, whatever you see, don't look away. You need to remember this time." The creature tensed, its form seeming to grow larger, darker, more terrible with each passing second. As it gathered itself for the final spring, I found myself thinking of all the stories I'd dismissed over the years, all the warnings I'd ignored. The world was older and darker than I'd ever imagined, and here, in this room with this impossible thing, I was about to learn just how deep that darkness went. The adversary launched itself toward us, a mass of shadow and teeth and ancient, hungry malevolence. I gripped the pouch Walter had given me, knowing that the next few seconds would either kill us or change us forever. Probably both. Time to find out which. Time slowed to a crawl as I hurled the pouch into the flames. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The fire exploded upward, turning from orange to a searing blue-white that burned itself into my retinas. The creature was already airborne, its massive form blotting out everything else in my field of vision. In that moment, suspended between action and consequence, I finally remembered everything about the cave. I'd seen this before, not just tracks or signs, but the thing itself. It had been waiting in that deepest chamber, coiled around ancient bones and forgotten offerings. I'd dropped my flashlight, but even in the darkness, its eyes had burned like twin stars falling into oblivion. I'd run then, leaving behind more than just my gear. I'd left behind my understanding of what was possible, what was real. Now there was nowhere to run. The impact knocked both Walter and me backwards as the creature slammed into us with the force of a freight train. Claws raked across my chest, but the pain felt distant, unimportant. The herb-filled pouch had done something to the fire, transformed it into something that felt alive, hungry. Blue-white flames reached out like grasping hands, catching hold of the creature's midnight fur. The sound it made defied description. Part scream, part roar, but underlaid with something that reminded me of radio static, of signals from deep space. Its form began to unravel. That's the only word I can think of to describe what happened next. Like a sweater coming undone, but instead of yarn, it was reality itself that was being pulled apart. "Don't look away!" Walter's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to see what it really is." The creature's outer form burned away like paper in a blast furnace, revealing something underneath that my mind struggled to comprehend. geometries that shouldn't exist, patterns that made my eyes water and my temples throb. This was its true form, something that had put on flesh like a man puts on a coat, something that had never been meant to walk in our world. The fire reached deeper, and the thing's shape collapsed in on itself, folding into dimensions that shouldn't have been possible. Each movement sent ripples through the air like heat waves off hot asphalt. But these distortions seemed to affect more than just vision. Sound warped and bent. Time itself seemed to hiccup and stutter. In those moments of temporal distortion, I saw flashes of other times, other encounters. Native warriors with torches, Spanish conquistadors with blessed flame, my own ancestors facing this same creature across centuries. It had always been here, hunting on the edges of our world, taking what it wanted. And we had always fought back, passing down the knowledge of fire and sacred herbs, of how to defeat what could not be killed. The final implosion was almost anticlimactic. One moment the creature was there, a writhing mass of impossible angles and ancient hunger, and the next it was simply gone. The blue-white flames died down to normal orange, then to embers. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the settling of the old house around us. Walter broke the silence first, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Hell of a job interview, wouldn't you say?" A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, slightly hysterical but genuine. "Does this mean I got the position?" He managed a weak smile as he pulled himself to his feet, wincing at what would definitely be impressive bruises tomorrow. "Seems like you've got the necessary experience." The cleanup took hours, not just the physical debris, the broken furniture, the scattered artifacts, the bloody floorboards, but the metaphysical aftermath as well. Walter showed me how to cleanse the space with sage and cedar, how to lay down protective lines of blessed cornmeal, how to strengthen the barriers between our world and whatever lay beyond. As we worked, he told me more about the creature, the adversary. It wasn't a skinwalker, though it sometimes took similar forms. It was something older, something that had been here before the first people walked these lands. The Navajo had many stories about it, as did the Hopi, the Apache, and others. Each culture had its own name for it, its own rituals for fighting it, but the core truth remained the same. It could be driven back, but never truly destroyed. "It'll be back then?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Walter nodded, laying down another line of cornmeal. "Always does. Might be years, might be decades, but it remembers, and it holds grudges." The sun was rising by the time we finished, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Walter's horses had returned to their pastures, grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. But they stayed in tight groups, always keeping watch. They knew, better than most, what lurked in the shadows. "So what happens now?" I asked, watching the new day dawn over the ancient land. Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon. "Now? Now you start learning. Really learning. Not just about horses and ranch work, though there'll be plenty of that. But about the old ways, the real ways. About what's really out there, and what we can do about it." He turned to face me, his eyes clear and direct. "That's why Loretta sent you to me. She sees things, knows things. Knew you were ready to remember what happened in that cave, ready to face what's really out there. Question is, are you willing to stay, to learn?" I looked out over the ranch, at the horses moving like dark shadows across the golden grass, at the red cliffs catching the first full light of morning. I thought about all the years I'd spent running, all the memories I'd tried to bury. Maybe it was time to stop running, time to stand and fight. "Yes," I said simply. "I'll stay." Walter nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. For now, let's see about getting some coffee and breakfast. Fighting ancient evils works up an appetite." As we walked back to the house, I could feel the weight of all those ancient stories settling around my shoulders like a familiar blanket. I wasn't just Joshua Treehorn anymore, drifter and failed tour guide. I was part of something older, something that stretched back through generations of watchful guardians who stood against the darkness. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. But we knew better now. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a living thing, hungry and patient. And somewhere out there in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, the adversary was waiting, watching, remembering. Let it watch. Let it remember. We would be ready. Years have passed since that first night at the Duncan Ranch. I'm still here, still learning. Walter's getting older now, his hair more white than gray, but his eyes are still sharp as ever. We've had other encounters with things that shouldn't exist, some worse than others, some that left scars both visible and hidden. But we've survived. We've protected what needed protecting. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls across the desert like a hungry thing, I think about that cave where it all started. Think about the young man I was, so sure he understood how the world worked. I think about all the others who've faced the darkness across the centuries, all the stories passed down in whispers and warnings. I'm a keeper of those stories now, a guardian of ancient knowledge. And sometimes when travelers stop at the trading post looking for work, looking for a fresh start, I see something in their eyes, a hint of recognition, a ghost of memory. And I think about what Loretta saw in me all those years ago. The darkness is still out there, patient and hungry as ever. But so are we, watching, waiting, ready. And the stories go on. My name is Marcus Thorne, and what I'm about to share happened to me on October 7th, 1995. The events of that weekend have haunted me ever since, changing not just how I view the wilderness, but how I understand the thin line between the known and unknown. I had decided to take my RV out for what should have been a peaceful weekend camping trip to Blackwater Falls State Park in West Virginia. It wasn't my first visit to the park. I'd been there at least half a dozen times before, drawn by its serene atmosphere and the way the falling water created a constant, soothing white noise that seemed to wash away the stress of everyday life. As a high school English teacher at Charleston West High, I desperately needed these occasional escapes from the endless stack of papers to grade and the constant chaos of teenage drama. I set off early that Friday morning with my dog Max riding shotgun, just as he had done for the past 7 years. Max was a magnificent German shepherd, 100 pounds of muscle and loyalty, who had been by my side since he was a pup. Despite his imposing size and fierce appearance, he was incredibly gentle, the kind of dog who would let my students' younger siblings climb all over him during school events, yet would stand protectively between me and any stranger who approached too quickly. His dark eyes held an almost human-like intelligence, and over the years, I'd learned to trust his instincts about people and situations. The drive to the park was pleasant, with the October trees creating a canopy of red and gold above the winding mountain roads. We arrived around noon, the sun high and bright in a cloudless sky. I found a perfect spot by the Blackwater River, where the sound of rushing water provided a natural soundtrack to our wilderness retreat. The location was ideal, far enough from other campers to feel secluded, but not so remote as to be completely isolated. I took my time setting up camp, arranging the RV just right, and setting out my camping chairs with a view of both the river and the surrounding forest. The afternoon passed peacefully as I alternated between reading Jon Krakauer's Into the Wild, perhaps not the most appropriate choice in retrospect, and trying my luck with some fly fishing in the river. Max spent the day doing what he loved best, exploring the perimeter of our campsite, chasing squirrels up trees, and occasionally splashing in the shallower parts of the river. It was around sunset when I first noticed something was off. The temperature had dropped suddenly, as it often does in the mountains, and I was just thinking about starting a fire when I noticed Max's behavior change dramatically. He stopped his playful exploration and began pacing nervously at the forest's edge, his ears pricked forward and his tail low. What struck me most was the way he kept making these low, keening sounds. Not quite whimpers, but something more primal, almost like he was trying to warn me of something. Even now, years later, I keep my doors double locked and maintain a strict policy of never going outdoors after sunset. I've switched to teaching online courses at the local community college. I tell people it's for the flexibility, but truthfully, I can't handle being alone in an empty school building anymore. The police report labeled it as a bear attack, and most people seem content with that explanation. But I know what I saw that night at Blackwater Falls. Sometimes on particularly quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my apartment, I could swear I hear Max's warning whimper again. And occasionally, in that brief moment between sleep and waking, I catch a glimpse of those glowing red eyes in the darkness of my bedroom. They say time heals all wounds, but some experiences leave scars that never truly fade. The police investigation lasted 3 weeks, led by Detective Sarah Reeves, a veteran of the West Virginia State Police who specialized in wildlife-related incidents. I could tell from her carefully neutral expression during our interviews that she didn't believe my story, at least not the parts about the creature. She focused instead on documenting the physical evidence, the slash marks on my RV's tires, which she attributed to a bear, the destruction at the ranger station, vandals, she claimed, and poor Max's remains, which were sent to a state wildlife pathologist. The pathologist's report came back with frustratingly vague conclusions. The wounds on Max's body were inconsistent with known regional predators, but they suggested this might be due to multiple animals being involved. They found unusual saliva samples that couldn't be properly categorized. The lab results came back with contradictory markers suggesting both canine and ursine DNA. When I pressed for more specific answers, I was politely but firmly told that the state wouldn't be allocating any more resources to the investigation. My research in the months following the incident became almost obsessive. I took a semester of unpaid leave from teaching, using my savings to drive back and forth across West Virginia, interviewing locals and collecting stories. I filled notebooks with accounts from other people who'd had strange encounters in the Appalachian wilderness. A retired logger in Tucker County described finding massive, inexplicable footprints in freshly fallen snow. A highway maintenance worker showed me photographs of deer carcasses found in trees 40 feet off the ground. An elderly Cherokee woman in a nearby town told me stories passed down through generations about something her people called the Hungry One, a creature that was once human, but had been transformed by isolation and desperation into something that fed not just on flesh, but on fear itself. The local historical society proved to be an unexpected source of information. Their archives contained newspapers dating back to the 1800s, with scattered reports of similar incidents. In 1879, an entire logging camp of 12 men vanished without a trace. In 1923, a family of 4 disappeared from their homestead near the current park boundaries. Only their youngest daughter was found, wandering in the woods 3 days later, unable or unwilling to speak about what had happened. In 1957, 3 college students on a hiking trip went missing. They were found 2 weeks later, alive but severely traumatized, each telling the same story about a creature that could mimic human voices. But the more I dug, the more doors began to close. People who had initially been willing to talk suddenly claimed they couldn't remember our conversations. The Historical Society suffered a convenient basement flood that damaged many of the old newspapers I'd been studying. The wildlife pathologist who had examined Max's remains took early retirement and moved to Florida, leaving no forwarding address. Even Detective Reeves stopped returning my calls. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Karen Mitchell, who specialized in PTSD. She helped me understand that my obsession with documenting these incidents was a way of trying to make sense of my trauma, to impose order on a chaotic and terrifying experience. She suggested that perhaps the exact nature of what I encountered that night mattered less than how I chose to move forward with my life. I knew she was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Last month, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single page from what appeared to be an old journal dated 1847. The handwriting was faded but legible, describing an encounter remarkably similar to mine. At the bottom of the page was a note in fresher ink: "You're not crazy. Be careful who you trust." I've spent hours trying to trace the paper's origin, but like everything else connected to that night, the truth remains frustratingly out of reach. I still teach, but I've moved to the city now, Charleston, where the constant noise of traffic and people helps drown out the memories of that unnatural silence in the woods. I keep Max's collar in my desk drawer, and sometimes when I'm grading papers late at night, I take it out and run my fingers over his worn name tag. I've thought about getting another dog, but it wouldn't be fair to the animal. I know now that there are things in this world that we're not equipped to understand or fight against, and I couldn't bear the responsibility of putting another loyal friend in harm's way. The official explanation remains that it was a bear attack, possibly triggered by territory encroachment or food scarcity. The Park Service posted additional warning signs about wildlife safety, and life in the area went on as usual. But every now and then I hear rumors of other incidents: hikers going missing, strange sounds in the night, unexplained livestock deaths. The locals don't talk about it much, at least not to outsiders, but you can see it in their eyes when the sun starts to set. They hurry home a little faster, lock their doors a little tighter. Some nights when I can't sleep, I find myself on my computer scanning local news sites for any unusual reports from the Blackwater Falls area. Most of the time it's quiet, but occasionally I'll find something. A missing hiker, an abandoned campsite, a series of unusual animal deaths. And every time I think about calling Detective Reeves or reaching out to the Park Service. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes, that terrible intelligence that was neither human nor animal, and I close my laptop and try to forget. I know this story sounds unbelievable. If someone had told it to me before that weekend in 1995, I would have dismissed it as a campfire tale or a vivid imagination. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And sometimes, knowledge is a heavier burden than uncertainty. So I keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn, and I try to find comfort in the mundane routines of daily life. But I never forget that somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, in the deep woods around Blackwater Falls, something is waiting. Something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. 27 years have passed since that night at Blackwater Falls, and while the acute terror has faded into a chronic unease, certain patterns have emerged that I can no longer ignore. It started with an email 3 years ago from a graduate student at West Virginia University named Jennifer Chen. She was researching disappearances in the Appalachian region for her anthropology thesis and had somehow found my old blog posts about the incident. Most of these posts had been taken down years ago, not by me, but she'd managed to find archived versions. Jennifer's research was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. She'd created a detailed database of unexplained incidents across the Appalachian Mountains, stretching from Georgia to Maine. When plotted on a map, these incidents formed distinct clusters, with Blackwater Falls sitting at the center of one of the largest concentrations. But what caught my attention wasn't just the geographical pattern, it was the temporal one. The incidents seemed to follow a cyclical pattern, peaking every 25, 30 years. We met for coffee at a busy Starbucks in downtown Charleston. Jennifer was a serious young woman with quick eyes and a methodical approach to her research. She spread out printed maps and graphs across the table, speaking in low tones about her findings. According to her data, we were approaching another peak period. She had police reports, newspaper clippings, and interviews with dozens of witnesses who'd had encounters similar to mine. Some details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. The unnatural silence before an encounter, animals behaving strangely, the feeling of being watched, and in the few direct sightings, those distinctive red eyes. 2 weeks after our meeting, Jennifer's apartment was broken into. Her laptop, external hard drives, and research notebooks were all taken, though valuable electronics and jewelry were left untouched. The police called it a random burglary, but she and I knew better. She sent me one final email before disappearing from social media entirely. "They don't want us connecting the dots. The pattern is real. Stay safe." Her words haunted me, especially as reports began trickling in from the Blackwater Falls area over the next few months. 3 hikers disappeared in separate incidents. A wildlife photographer's equipment was found abandoned along a trail, his memory cards missing. A local TV station did a brief story about unusual animal behavior in the park. Deer abandoning their usual territories, birds going silent in the middle of the day, entire packs of coyotes seemingly vanishing overnight. I started having the dreams again. Not the usual nightmares about that night, but something new. In these dreams, I'm back at the park, but it's different. The trees are older, twisted into impossible shapes. I hear voices calling from the darkness. Sometimes Max's barking, sometimes Jennifer's voice, sometimes sounds that could be human but aren't quite right. And always, always that sense of something vast and patient watching, waiting, hungry not just for flesh but for something deeper. Last week I received another unmarked envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that simply said, 1,847 to 2,024 inches. The drive contained hundreds of files, police reports, witness statements, historical documents, and photographs spanning nearly 2 centuries. Some were in Jennifer's distinctive organizational style, but others appeared to come from sources I couldn't identify. The most recent file was a satellite image of the Blackwater Falls area taken 3 months ago. It showed something that made my blood run cold, a pattern of dead vegetation forming a perfect spiral, centered on the spot where I'd found Max that night. I've made copies of everything and stored them in secure locations. This account, too, will be preserved in multiple places. I'm writing this not just to document what happened to me, but to warn others. There's something out there, something that's been there longer than the park, longer than the settlers, maybe longer than human memory itself. It operates on a timeline we can barely comprehend, working to a pattern we're only beginning to understand. The locals have their own way of dealing with it. If you visit the small towns around Blackwater Falls, you'll notice certain practices they don't discuss with outsiders. Iron horseshoes above doorways. Red threads tied around children's wrists during certain months. The way they never say good night, but instead tell each other to stay in the light. Little traditions passed down through generations. Their original meanings lost, but their purpose unchanged. To ward off something they've learned to live alongside but never to trust. Dr. Mitchell, my therapist, retired last year. In our final session, she said something that struck me. Sometimes the most rational response to an irrational world is to accept that there are things we don't understand. I've come to believe she's right, but I've also learned that acceptance doesn't mean passivity. I've started compiling my own database, creating my own maps. I maintain contact with a small network of others who've had similar experiences. We're careful, paranoid even, but we share information. We watch for patterns. We keep track of the cycles. The creature I encountered that night may not have been a Wendigo, as some legends suggest, or it might be something that inspired those legends in the first place. Names are less important than understanding, and understanding is less important than survival. What matters is that it's real. It's still out there. And if Jennifer's research is correct, it's becoming more active. I still teach, though I've moved to online-only courses. My students sometimes ask why I never use video for our virtual lectures. They assume it's because I'm old-fashioned or technologically challenged. I let them think that. It's better than explaining that I'm afraid of what might appear in my webcam's background, in the darkness behind me, especially on late autumn evenings when the sun sets early and the shadows grow long. To anyone reading this who might venture into those mountains, be careful. If you're camping and your dog starts acting strange, leave immediately. If you hear familiar voices calling from deep in the woods, don't follow them. And if you're ever at Blackwater Falls as the sun is setting, and you feel eyes watching you from the tree line, don't try to be brave. Don't try to investigate. Just run. Because out there, in the ancient hollows of the Appalachians, something is stirring. Something that remembers every encounter, every witness, every escape. Something that can wait decades between feedings because it knows, with a patience that predates human civilization, that there will always be another curious hiker, another solitary camper, another person who thinks they're prepared for whatever they might encounter in the wilderness. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear scratching at my window or catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, I wonder if it's still watching me. I wonder if it's been watching all of us all along, treating our brief human lifespans as mere moments in its eternal hunger. I wonder if Max knew, in those final moments, what we'd stumbled into. And I wonder, as the cycle Jennifer identified approaches its peak, how many more will encounter what I did before it retreats again into legend and shadow, waiting for the next cycle to begin. October 16, 1977. That date is seared into my memory like a brand on cattle. It was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about nature, about what's really out there in the depths of the forest. My name's Jack Hawkins, and I've been a search and rescue officer in Humboldt County, California for nearly a decade. I thought I'd seen it all, but I was dead wrong. The morning started like any other. I woke up at dawn, the cool autumn air seeping through my bedroom window. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand. I gazed out at the redwoods that surrounded my cabin, their massive trunks disappearing into the morning mist. Little did I know that in just a few hours, those same trees would become the backdrop to a nightmare. I arrived at the station just as the sun was starting to burn off the fog. Sheriff Tom Landry was already there, his weathered face creased with concern. "Jack," he said, motioning me over. "Got a situation, 2 hikers overdue." I nodded, slipping into work mode. "Details?" Tom handed me a manila folder. "Jessica Roth and Lauren Simmons, both 22, recent grads from Humboldt State. They were supposed to be back Sunday night from a long weekend hike. Families called it in yesterday evening when they couldn't reach them." I flipped through the file. Pictures of 2 smiling young women looked back at me. Jessica, a redhead with freckles and a wide grin. Lauren, darker-skinned with curly black hair and glasses. Both looked like typical college kids, full of life and adventure. "Any idea of their planned route?" I asked, already mentally mapping out the most likely trails. Tom spread out a topographic map on his desk. "They told their families they were planning to hike the old Redwood Creek Trail. It's not heavily trafficked, but it's not particularly challenging either. Mostly used by locals for day hikes." I traced the trail with my finger. It wound through some of the oldest growth in the county, massive redwoods that had stood sentinel for centuries. Beautiful country, but it could turn deadly if you weren't prepared. "All right," I said, straightening up. "I'll head out with a small team. No need for a full search party yet. Probably just got turned around or had some minor equipment failure." Tom nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We both knew that in our line of work, hope for the best but prepare for the worst was more than just a saying. I gathered my gear, backpack with first aid supplies, extra water, high-energy rations, and a handheld radio. I clipped my sidearm to my belt standard procedure, though I'd rarely had cause to use it on rescue operations. As I was heading out, I bumped into Dave Erickson and Beth Cho, 2 of our most experienced volunteer SAR members. "Hey, Jack," Dave called out. "Heard about the missing hikers. Need an extra set of hands?" I sized them up. Dave was in his mid-30s, stocky and strong from years of working as a logger. Beth, a few years younger, was wiry and quick, with keen eyes that didn't miss much. Both had been on dozens of searches with me over the years. "Could use the help," I admitted. "Grab your gear and meet me at the trailhead in 30. They nodded and headed off to prep. I climbed into my beat-up Ford Bronco, the engine growling to life as I turned the key. As I pulled out of the station, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this call felt different, off somehow. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. Focus on the facts, on the search. That's what mattered now. The drive to the trailhead took about 45 minutes, winding through increasingly dense forest. The road narrowed, gravel crunching under my tires. I pulled into the small parking area just as Dave and Beth arrived in Dave's pickup. We gathered at the trailhead, going over our gear one last time. The trail stretched before us, disappearing into the gloom of the forest. The redwoods loomed overhead, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and moss on the forest floor. "All right," I said, shouldering my pack. "We'll follow their planned route." Keep your eyes peeled for any signs of recent passage. Broken twigs, disturbed ground, anything out of place. Radio check every 30 minutes. Let's move out. As we set off down the trail, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I glanced back at the parking lot, now hidden by a bend in the path. The forest seemed to close in around us, swallowing us whole. Little did I know that with each step we were walking deeper into a mystery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The first mile of the hike was uneventful. The trail was well maintained, winding between the massive redwoods. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. In any other circumstance, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful. But today, every shadow seemed to hide a potential clue or a potential threat. "Jack," Beth called out, kneeling by the side of the trail. "Take a look at this." I moved over to where she was crouched. A small piece of bright orange fabric was caught on a thorny bush, fluttering slightly in the breeze. "Good eye," I said, carefully removing the scrap. "Matches the description of Jessica's windbreaker." Dave joined us, peering at the fabric. "Think they went off trail here?" I scanned the surrounding area. The underbrush was thick, but I could make out what might have been a makeshift path pushing through the ferns. "Possibly," I replied. "But let's stick to the main trail for now. Mark this spot on the GPS. We can come back and check it out if we don't find anything further ahead." We pressed on, our senses heightened. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush drew our attention. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. About 2 miles in, the trail opened up into a small clearing. It was a popular spot for overnight campers, with a fire pit and a few log benches scattered around. As soon as we entered the clearing, I knew something was wrong. "Oh God," Beth whispered, her face pale. The clearing looked like a war zone. A tent lay in tatters, its fabric shredded and poles bent at unnatural angles. Supplies were scattered everywhere. A sleeping bag hanging from a low branch, a backpack spilling its contents onto the damp earth. What looked like the remains of a meal were strewn across the fire pit, half-eaten and rotting. "Spread out," I ordered, my voice tight. "Look for any signs of the girls, and be careful. Whatever did this might still be around." We moved through the clearing methodically, documenting everything we found. My stomach churned as I came across a single hiking boot, ripped open like it was made of paper. Dark stains marred the leather blood without a doubt. "Jack," Dave called out, his voice shaky. "You need to see this." He was standing at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention. A set of tracks led away from the campsite, disappearing into the underbrush. But these weren't human tracks, nor any animal prints I'd ever seen before. The prints were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. They were deep, too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. But it was the shape that sent a chill down my spine. They looked almost human-like, but distorted, with long, curved claw marks at the ends of each toe. "What the hell could have made these?" Dave asked, his face ashen. I shook my head, unable to form a response. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear attack? Some kind of large cat? But deep down, I knew these tracks belonged to something else entirely. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. "Get a full search team out here, maybe bring in some wildlife experts." As I raised the radio to my lips, a sound echoed through the clearing. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, then rose to a piercing shriek that set my teeth on edge. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part bird cry, part animal roar, with an almost human-like quality that made my skin crawl. Beth let out a small whimper, her eyes wide with fear. Dave had his rifle up, scanning the tree line. I felt frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. "We need to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" We gathered our gear quickly, eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. As we prepared to leave the clearing, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. High up in the canopy, something dark and massive shifted, branches creaking under its weight. "Run!" I hissed, and we took off down the trail. The forest blurred around us as we ran, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear Beth's ragged breathing behind me, Dave's heavy footfalls to my right. But over it all, I heard something else, the sound of something big moving through the trees, keeping pace with us effortlessly. We burst out of the forest onto an old logging road, gasping for air. I fumbled with my radio, finally managing to get a signal. "This is Officer Hawkins," I panted into the mic. "We need immediate backup at the Redwood Creek trailhead. Possible animal attack. 2 hikers missing. Send everything you've got." As I lowered the radio, I caught Dave's eye. The look on his face mirrored what I was feeling. A mix of fear, confusion, and the sinking realization that we were in way over our heads. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness began to fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had destroyed that campsite and left those impossible tracks, it was still out there. And somehow I knew it was watching us, waiting for its moment to strike. The wait for backup felt like an eternity. We huddled on the logging road, eyes scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the usual evening chorus of birds and insects was absent, leaving only the whisper of wind through the redwoods. "What do you think it was?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know. In all my years out here, I've never seen anything like those tracks." Dave was pacing, his rifle held tight against his chest. "Could it be a bear? Maybe one that's sick or injured?" "No bear I've ever seen moves like that," I replied. "And that sound, that wasn't any animal I know." The crackle of the radio made us all jump. "Officer Hawkins, this is Deputy Collins. We're about 15 minutes out. What's your situation?" I brought the radio to my lips. "We're holding position on the old logging road, about 2 miles in from the trailhead. No visual on the missing hikers, but we found their campsite. It's bad, Collins. Something tore it apart." "Understood," came the reply. "Sit tight. We're coming in hot." As I lowered the radio, a twig snapped in the forest to our left. We all whirled toward the sound, Dave raising his rifle. "Did you see that?" Beth hissed, pointing into the gloom. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved between the trees, something big, much bigger than a person. It seemed to flow through the undergrowth, more liquid than solid. "Get behind me," I ordered, drawing my sidearm. The shape paused at the edge of the road, partially hidden by a massive redwood. In the fading light I could make out a hulking form, easily 9 feet tall. Thick dark fur covered its body, not brown like a bear's, but a deep oily black that seemed to absorb what little light remained. Then it stepped into full view, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Its limbs were too long, too powerful, ending in hands, if you could call them that, tipped with claws like butcher's hooks. But it was the face that froze the blood in my veins. The head was squat and wide, perched on a thick, muscular neck. But the eyes, God, those eyes. They were huge, easily the size of softballs, and a sickly yellow color that seemed to glow in the twilight. And they were fixed directly on us. For a moment, everything was still. I could hear Beth's ragged breathing behind me, smell the acrid scent of fear rolling off Dave in waves. The creature's chest heaved with each breath, a low rumble emanating from deep within. Then, faster than anything that size had any right to move, it charged. Dave's rifle cracked, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The creature stumbled, roaring in pain and rage. But it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to focus all its fury on Dave. "Run!" I screamed, firing my own weapon. The bullet seemed to have little effect, barely slowing the monster's charge. Beth took off down the road, but Dave was frozen in place, fumbling to reload his rifle. I saw the realization in his eyes a split second before the creature reached him. Then, in a blur of fur and flashing claws, Dave went down. The sounds that followed will haunt me for the rest of my life. The ripping of flesh, the cracking of bones, and underneath it all, Dave's agonized screams. I fired again and again, until my clip was empty. The creature barely seemed to notice, focused entirely on its grisly task. When it finally looked up from Dave's broken body, its muzzle was dark with blood. Those yellow eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew true terror. This wasn't an animal driven by instinct and hunger. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a malevolence that went beyond anything in the natural world. I ran. God help me, I ran and didn't look back. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. The stench of its breath, hot and rotten, washed over me. I knew I couldn't outrun it, knew that any second those claws would tear into my back. Then, miraculously, I heard sirens in the distance. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees. The creature let out a frustrated roar and veered off into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled onto the road just as the first police cruiser pulled up. Deputy Collins leaped out, his face pale in the flashing lights. "Jack, what the hell happened? Where are the others?" I couldn't speak. My legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I remember before passing out was the taste of blood in my mouth and the lingering image of those terrible yellow eyes. I woke up in the hospital, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. My body ached all over and my throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. Maybe I had been. Sheriff Landry was there, his face grim. "Jack," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "What happened? Where's Beth? And Dave?" The look on Tom's face told me everything I needed to know. "We found Beth about a mile down the road," he said. "She's shaken up, but physically okay. Dave, I'm sorry, Jack. There wasn't anything left to save." The memories came flooding back. The destroyed campsite, those impossible tracks, and that thing. That monster that had torn Dave apart like he was made of paper. "The hikers?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Tom shook his head slowly. "No sign of them, Jack. We've had search teams combing the area for days, found some of their gear scattered around, but nothing else." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. Those poor girls, and Dave. God, Dave. His face flashed in my mind, the look of terror in his eyes just before. "Jack," Tom said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there." I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I possibly explain what we'd seen? What would happen if I told the truth? Would they think I was crazy? Hell, maybe I was crazy. It was an animal attack," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Some kind of bear, maybe. Biggest damn thing I've ever seen. It came out of nowhere, took Dave down before we could—" My voice cracked and I couldn't continue. Tom put a hand on my shoulder, his face a mask of sympathy and barely concealed doubt. "All right, Jack," he said. "Get some rest. We'll talk more later." As he left the room, I knew he didn't believe me. How could he? But I also knew I could never tell him the truth. Who would believe that some creature, something that shouldn't exist, was out there in those woods? The next few weeks passed in a blur. I was released from the hospital, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to work. The nightmares came every night. Dave's screams, those yellow eyes, the feeling of being hunted through endless dark forests. Beth came to see me once. We sat on my porch staring out at the redwoods, not speaking. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, what we'd experienced, but talking about it, acknowledging it out loud, somehow made it more real. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can't stay here anymore. Can't look at those trees without—" She trailed off, but I understood. Part of me wanted to leave too, to run as far from these woods as I could get. But something held me back. A sense of unfinished business, maybe, or the irrational fear that if I left, that thing might follow. Weeks turned into months. Life in the county slowly returned to normal. The search for the missing hikers was called off, their disappearance joining the long list of unsolved mysteries in these parts. Dave's funeral was a somber affair, his casket closed. The official report listed his death as the result of a bear attack. I eventually went back to work, but things were different. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I ventured into the forest. Every shadow held potential danger. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the newfound jumpiness, the way I'd sometimes trail off mid-sentence, lost in thought. It was almost a year later when it happened again. Another missing hiker, another destroyed campsite. I was first on the scene, and as soon as I saw those familiar tracks in the soft earth, I knew. It was back. I stood there, frozen as my radio crackled with calls for backup. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't let what happened to Dave, to those girls, happen to anyone else. I had to end this one way or another. I unclipped my radio and set it on a nearby stump. Then, with nothing but my sidearm and the clothes on my back, I set off into the deepening gloom of the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. But for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of calm. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I heard it, that low, rumbling growl that had haunted my dreams for so long. I turned slowly, and there it was. Those yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, filled with a terrible intelligence. "All right, you bastard," I whispered, raising my gun. "Let's finish this." The creature let out a roar that shook the very ground and charged. In that moment, surrounded by the ancient redwoods that had seen so much over the centuries, I faced my nightmare head-on. What happened next? Well, that's a story for another time. But I will say this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilization. And sometimes, when the night is dark and the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still hear that unearthly howl echoing through the redwoods. So if you ever find yourself in the forests of Humboldt County, stick to the trails. And if you hear something moving in the undergrowth, something too big to be a deer or a bear, run. Run, and don't look back. Because there are some things in this world that man was never meant to face. "8 years is a long time to work anywhere, but out at Lonesome Pine Reserve, time moves differently. Nestled deep in the Appalachians where civilization feels like a distant memory, the reserve sprawls across thousands of acres of dense forest, steep ravines, and forgotten hollows. Most folks don't even know it exists, and that's just how we like it. I'm Saul Hendricks, former Memphis firefighter turned park ranger after a career-ending knee injury. The transition wasn't easy, trading sirens and city lights for the profound silence of these ancient woods, but it suited me. At least it did until last October, when everything I thought I knew about these mountains changed forever. It started with the disappearances. First, it was Carl Mackenzie's goats. 3 of them vanished overnight from his farm just outside the reserve's boundaries. Then the Wilsons lost their shepherd, and the Hendersons their barn cat. People whispered about bears, but I'd tracked enough bears in my time to know better. Bears leave signs, broken branches, scattered garbage, distinctive prints in the mud. This was different. The weather that autumn had been unusual. Thick fog rolled in most mornings, clinging to the valleys until well past noon. The locals said it was the worst they'd seen in decades. The moisture made everything feel heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on you. And then there was the smell. I first noticed it during my routine patrol of the southern boundary. A sickly sweet odor that reminded me of roadkill left too long in the summer sun, but more industrial somehow, like decay mixed with diesel fuel. I radioed Avery about it. She'd been working the northern section for about 5 years, and if anyone would know about strange occurrences, it'd be her. "Probably just a dead deer," she said, her voice crackling through the static. "Though I've been getting complaints about the smell from hikers up here too." That should have been my first warning. Lonesome Pine is vast. A smell carrying that far wasn't natural. The disappearances escalated. The Burke's draft horse, a massive Clydesdale named Thunder, vanished from a locked stable. The gate hadn't been broken. It was still latched from the outside. But inside we found deep gouges in the wooden walls and a strange, viscous substance on the floor that looked like tar but smelled like copper and rot. I started carrying my old hunting rifle on patrols after that. Never needed a weapon before. Most dangerous thing you'd typically encounter was the occasional startled black bear or angry mama moose. But something felt wrong in those woods now. The birds had gone quiet. The usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush had ceased. Even the insects seemed subdued. It was during one of these armed patrols that I found the first real evidence of what we were dealing with. I was checking the old logging trails, obsolete paths that hadn't seen maintenance in years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The fog was thick that day, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead. The smell was overwhelming. The first sign was the blood. Not drops or splashes, but sheets of it, painting the forest floor in cruel, abstract patterns. Following the trail led me to a clearing I didn't recognize, though I thought I knew every inch of this section. The ground had been churned up like a tilled field, but the furrows were deeper, more violent. And there, in the center, lay what remained of Thunder. The horse's massive body had been transformed. Not eaten, not torn apart, transformed. The flesh had been peeled back with surgical precision in some places and savagely ripped away in others. The skeleton had been rearranged, bones twisted into impossible angles, some seemingly melted and reformed. The head was missing entirely. I've seen my share of animal attacks. Bears leave distinctive wounds. Mountain lions are precise. Wolves work as a pack. This was something else entirely. This was methodical yet chaotic, purposeful yet mindless. And it was fresh. Steam still rose from the exposed flesh despite the cool autumn air. That's when I heard it. Have you ever stood in absolute silence? Not the quiet of a library or the stillness of night, but true silence, when even your heartbeat seems muted? That's what happened first. Every ambient sound simply stopped, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Then came the breathing. It was wet, labored, like someone drowning in their own fluids. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I raised my rifle, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. The fog had thickened, forming a wall around the clearing. And through that wall emerged something that shouldn't exist. It moved like liquid shadow, its form constantly shifting and reforming. The basic shape suggested something vaguely lupine, but the proportions were all wrong. Its shoulders were too broad, its limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. The head was the worst part, a twisted amalgamation of wolf and boar, with too many eyes that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it. Where its mouth should have been, there was instead a writhing mass of appendages that looked like a cross between tentacles and tongues. The rifle felt pathetically inadequate, but I fired anyway. The sound was deafening in the unnatural silence. The creature jerked as the bullet hit, but instead of blood, a thick black substance oozed from the wound. The hole closed almost immediately. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, the next it was nearly on top of me. I dove to the side, feeling the wind of its passage as those appendages whipped past my face. The smell of rot and chemicals was overwhelming. I ran. There's no shame in admitting it. Training, experience, weapons, none of it matters when you're faced with something that defies reality itself. I crashed through the underbrush, my bad knee screaming in protest. Behind me I could hear it moving, not the sound of feet or paws, but a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from all directions. The fog made navigation nearly impossible. Familiar landmarks became alien shapes in the mist. I had no idea if I was heading toward the ranger station or deeper into the wilderness. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, the rifle flying from my grasp. I rolled, expecting to feel those appendages wrapping around me at any moment. Instead, I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was at least 30 feet, with a creek running along the bottom. The creature emerged from the fog behind me, its form seeming to ripple and flow like smoke. In that moment, I made a choice that probably saved my life. I jumped. The impact with the water drove the air from my lungs. The creek was deeper than it looked, and the current surprisingly strong. I let it carry me downstream, staying under as long as I could. When I finally had to surface for air, I caught a glimpse of the creature pacing along the ravine edge. It made no attempt to follow. I dragged myself out of the water nearly a mile downstream. My radio was ruined, my rifle was lost, and my knee felt like it was on fire. But I was alive. I made it back to the ranger station just as night was falling. Avery was there, along with 2 state troopers who'd been called in about the missing animals. They didn't believe me at first. Who would? But the disappearances continued for another week. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The smell faded. The animals returned. The fog lifted. We never found Thunder's body, though we searched the area thoroughly. The clearing itself seemed to have vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The official report blamed the incidents on a rogue bear, despite the lack of evidence. The locals developed their own theories, everything from government experiments to ancient curses. I filed my report honestly, knowing it would probably end up buried in some folder marked unexplained. I still work at Lonesome Pine, still patrol those same trails. But I carry my rifle now, and I pay attention to the silences. Sometimes, on foggy days, I catch a whiff of that chemical decay on the wind. When that happens, I turn around and head back to the station. Some things, I've learned, are better left alone. The mountains are old and they keep their secrets well. What I encountered that day was just one of them, a reminder that the world is stranger and more terrible than we like to admit. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere in those ancient forests, in the deep hollows where sunlight never reaches, something is waiting. The state police investigation lasted 3 months. They brought in wildlife experts, forensic teams, even a cryptozoologist from the university. They found nothing conclusive, just scattered fur samples that didn't match any known species and strange chemical traces in the soil that the lab couldn't identify. What they did find was a pattern. Every 7 years, going back to the 1940s, Lonesome Pine experienced a surge of unexplained animal disappearances. They always occurred in autumn, always lasted exactly 17 days, and always stopped as suddenly as they began. The records were buried in old ranger logs and local newspaper archives, stories dismissed as tall tales or mass hysteria. But the physical evidence remained. Deep claw marks in old-growth trees, too high for any known predator. Patches of forest where nothing would grow, the soil tainted with that same unidentifiable chemical compound. And photographs, grainy, unclear, but showing something moving through the trees that didn't match any known animal profile. Winter came and went. Spring brought new growth, covering the scars in the forest. I kept expecting to wake up to more missing animals, more strange sounds in the night. But the mountains were quiet, almost too quiet. It wasn't until late March that I found the caves. They were hidden behind a rockfall that the spring thaw had dislodged, a network of tunnels stretching deep into the mountain. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in a familiar black residue. I went in alone, against every protocol and common sense. The tunnels went down for miles, branching and reconnecting like a giant web. In the deepest chamber I found them, hundreds of bones, some fresh, some ancient, all arranged in precise geometric patterns. And on the walls, carved into the stone with surgical precision, were markings that looked eerily like mathematical equations. That's when I understood. What we had encountered wasn't some undiscovered animal species. It was something else entirely, something that had been here long before us, something that emerged periodically to feed and study, like a scientist collecting specimens. I sealed the cave entrance with explosives, marking it as unstable on all official maps. Avery helped me cover it up. She'd seen enough herself to know some things are better left buried. The official report cites a geological hazard. 7 years have passed since that autumn. The fog is rolling in again, thick and unnatural. Yesterday I found fresh claw marks on the trees near the sealed cave. The birds have gone quiet. And that smell, that chemical decay, is back on the wind. I've arranged for all the local farmers to move their livestock indoors. The hiking trails are officially closed for maintenance. Avery and I have stocked the ranger station with enough supplies to last a month. We're ready this time, or at least we think we are. The thing about working in places like Lonesome Pine is that you learn to respect the unknown. The mountains have their own rules, their own rhythms. Some things out here don't fit into our neat categories of natural and supernatural. They simply are. I still patrol these trails, still carry my rifle, though I know now it won't do much good if that thing returns. But I watch the fog, and I listen to the silences, and I remember what I learned in that cave. We're not alone in these mountains. We never were. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind whispers through the trees, I think I hear something moving in the darkness, something vast and ancient and patient. And I wonder if what we encountered was just a scout, a single specimen from a larger colony sleeping somewhere in the deep places of the earth, waiting for their time to emerge. My name is Saul Hendricks, and this is my warning. If you find yourself in these mountains when the fog rolls in thick and unnatural, when the birds go quiet and that sweet chemical smell fills the air, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because every 7 years, something wakes in Lonesome Pine, and it's hungry for more than just livestock. I never expected my years as a Girl Scout to end with me questioning everything I believed about reality. Looking back now, I can trace a clear line from those early camping trips to the night that changed my life forever. But let me start at the beginning. I joined the Scouts at age 12, a shy kid who preferred books to people and indoor comforts to outdoor adventures. My parents thought it would build character and help me make friends. They weren't entirely wrong. Those first few months were challenging, learning knots, practicing first aid, and trying to start fires with nothing but twigs and determination. But something unexpected happened. I fell in love with the wilderness. Larch Hill became my second home. Located in the heart of the Wicklow Mountains, the campsite was a world unto itself. Dense forests of towering pines surrounded the clearing, their branches reaching toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks often shrouded in mist, creating an atmosphere that could shift from welcoming to menacing as quickly as the Irish weather. Our troop met every other weekend, but the overnight camping trips were what I lived for. We'd learn wilderness survival skills during the day, how to read maps, identify edible plants, and track animals. But it was the nights that really shaped us. Huddled around campfires, we'd share stories and forge friendships that felt unbreakable. Sarah became my best friend during one of these trips, when we both refused to eat the questionable stew our troop leader had prepared and ended up sharing a package of cookies instead. The ghost stories were always my favorite part. Each scout leader had their own version of the Lady of Larch Hill legend. Some said she was a young woman who got lost in the woods during a storm in the 1800s and still wandered the paths, searching for her way home. Others claimed she was the spirit of a heartbroken girl who died waiting for her lover to return from war. The older scouts whispered that she appeared to hikers who strayed too far from the marked trails, either warning them away from danger or luring them deeper into the forest, depending on who was telling the tale. I never took these stories seriously. Growing up in a household that valued science and rational explanation above all else, I dismissed them as campfire entertainment. Ghost stories were meant to scare younger scouts and add excitement to our camping trips. Nothing more. By 16, I had earned nearly every outdoor badge available. I could start a fire in the rain, navigate by stars, and identify dozens of local plants and animals. The mountains had become my sanctuary, a place where the anxieties of teenage life melted away. Sarah and I were inseparable, planning future hiking adventures and dreaming about leading our own scout troops someday. That's what makes what happened next so difficult to reconcile. How could someone who knew these woods so well, who prided herself on being practical and level-headed, experience something so impossible? The events of that night forced me to question everything I thought I knew about reality, about science, about what lurks in the spaces between what we can explain and what we can only fear. It started with a simple argument, the kind of petty disagreement that only teenage best friends can have. I don't even remember what sparked it now, though the consequences of that fight are forever etched in my memory. If Sarah and I hadn't been mad at each other, would we have still ventured out into the darkness that night? Would we have seen what we saw? The layout of Larch Hill campsite is crucial to understanding what happened. The main entrance opened onto a large gravel parking area with the welcome center and bathrooms positioned to the right. A long gravel path stretched straight ahead, with various camping fields branching off on either side. Our troop always preferred the backfield. It was more private and offered the best views of the mountains. That weekend, we had set up our camp with military precision, just as we'd been taught. The mess tent stood near the field entrance, serving as a landmark visible from anywhere in camp. Our sleeping tents were arranged in a rough semicircle at the bottom of the field, with Sarah's and mine positioned at the far end. One side of the field butted up against a dense line of trees and bushes, the beginning of the true forest that covered the mountainside. What happened that night began with a simple need and ended with a fundamental shift in how I view the world. But to understand the full impact, you need to know about the strange events that had been occurring in the weeks leading up to our fateful camping trip. Looking back, there were warnings, subtle at first, easily dismissed by those of us trained to seek rational explanations. 3 weeks before our final camping trip, our troop was doing routine maintenance on the trails when Emily, one of our younger scouts, came running back to the group. She was pale and shaking, claiming she'd seen a woman in a white dress standing among the trees, who vanished when Emily tried to get a closer look. Emily's sighting was just the beginning. During subsequent trips, other scouts reported odd occurrences: equipment moving overnight despite being properly secured, footprints appearing in muddy areas where no one had walked, and most disturbingly, the sound of someone humming an unfamiliar melody in the darkness beyond our campfire's light. Our troop leaders dismissed these stories as overactive imaginations, but I noticed they started enforcing the buddy system more strictly and rarely let anyone venture far from the main camp alone. Even the most experienced scouts were required to travel in pairs after sunset. Sarah and I discussed these incidents during our late-night conversations in our tent. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere at Larch Hill had changed. The familiar comfort of the woods had been replaced by something more oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The weekend of our final trip started normally enough. Our troop arrived Friday afternoon, the van pulling into the gravel parking area under overcast skies. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, but the forecast suggested it would hold off until Sunday. Perfect camping weather, cool enough to justify a roaring campfire but not so cold that we'd be uncomfortable in our tents. Sarah and I worked together setting up camp with the efficiency of long practice, though tension still simmered between us from our earlier argument. It was such a stupid fight. She'd accused me of flirting with her crush at school, while I maintained I was just being friendly. Looking back, the petty drama of teenage life seems almost laughable compared to what was coming. That evening, our troop leader announced we'd be doing a night hike the following day, taking advantage of the full moon to practice our navigation skills. Several of the younger scouts expressed nervousness, but I was excited. Night hikes were rare treats, usually reserved for the most experienced scouts. We spent Saturday preparing for the hike, checking our gear and reviewing trail maps. The plan was to follow the Eastern Ridge Trail, which offered spectacular views of the valley below. It was a moderately challenging route I'd hiked dozens of times in daylight, but darkness would add an entirely new dimension to the experience. The sun set early that Saturday, the light fading rapidly behind thick clouds that had rolled in during the afternoon. Our group of 12 gathered at the trailhead, headlamps ready but initially off to let our eyes adjust to the darkness. The air was unusually still, the typical evening breeze absent. Our troop leader, Miss O'Brien, gave us final instructions. Stay together, maintain visual contact with the person in front and behind, and most importantly, stay on the marked trail. We set off in single file, our footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles beneath our boots. The first hour passed uneventfully. The clouds occasionally parted, allowing glimpses of the full moon to illuminate our path. The forest was eerily quiet, no owls calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even our group's chatter gradually died away, replaced by focused concentration on the path ahead. I was positioned near the middle of the line, with Sarah 2 people behind me. Despite our lingering disagreement, her presence was reassuring. The familiar trail seemed different in the darkness, shadows transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes that teased the imagination. Then someone at the front of the line stopped abruptly. We heard Miss O'Brien consulting her map and GPS, speaking quietly with her assistant leader. Something was wrong. We should have reached the viewpoint overlooking the valley, but instead, dense forest surrounded us on all sides. The realization that we were off course triggered a ripple of unease through the group. Miss O'Brien maintained a calm demeanor, but I could hear the concern in her voice as she discussed options with the other leaders. According to the GPS, we were somehow nearly a kilometer west of where we should have been, despite following what we thought was the Eastern Trail. That's when we heard it. A soft humming carried on the still air, the same melody other scouts had reported hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, making it impossible to identify its source. Several of the younger scouts huddled together, while the leaders tried to maintain order. I felt a sudden urge to follow the sound, an almost physical pull toward something in the darkness beyond our lights. Sarah must have sensed my intention because she grabbed my arm, whispering urgently, "Don't even think about it." But the humming grew louder, more insistent. And now there was something else. A faint light weaving between the trees, like someone carrying a lantern at a great distance. Miss O'Brien ordered everyone to stay together, but the group was already fragmenting, some drawn toward the light while others wanted to retreat. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts from different scouts varied wildly. The light we'd seen suddenly multiplied, dozens of ghostly orbs dancing between the trees. The humming reached a fever pitch and then abruptly stopped, plunging us into absolute silence. In the beam of my headlamp, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was another scout, but the figure was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its movements unnaturally fluid. It stepped into the light, and several people screamed. The entity before us defied description, seeming to shift and change even as we watched. One moment it appeared as the legendary Lady of Larch Hill, wearing a flowing white dress that moved in a non-existent wind. The next it was something ancient and terrifying, its form suggesting a creature that had walked these woods long before humans arrived. Its face, if you could call it that, was a void, a darkness deeper than the night around us. But somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. In that moment I understood with terrible clarity that all our ghost stories and legends had barely scratched the surface of what truly dwelled in these woods. "Run!" Miss O'Brien's command shattered our paralysis. The group scattered, headlamp beams cutting wild arcs through the darkness as everyone fled in different directions. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, something pursued. We could hear it moving through the forest, not the crash of something large, but a subtle whisper of movement that somehow seemed worse. The humming returned, now discordant and threatening, growing louder as our pursuer gained ground. Sarah stumbled and nearly fell, but I held onto her hand so tightly I later found bruises on both our palms. We crashed through a thorny bush, pain barely registering through our panic. My headlamp beam caught glimpses of other scouts running through the trees, but in the chaos, it was impossible to know if we were heading toward safety or deeper into danger. Then Sarah's headlamp illuminated something familiar, the gravel path leading to the main campsite. We'd somehow made it back to Larch Hill. We ran harder, the sound of our feet on gravel oddly reassuring after the soft forest floor. Behind us, the presence that had been pursuing us seemed to hesitate at the edge of the woods. We reached the welcome center to find other groups of scouts arriving from different directions, all wide-eyed and breathing hard. Over the next hour, everyone made it back except Emily and one of the junior leaders. A search party was organized, and they were found huddled in a hollow tree less than 100 meters from the camp, both physically unhurt but deeply shaken. The official report claimed we had simply gotten lost and panicked, our minds playing tricks on us in the darkness. But sitting in the welcome center that night, drinking hot chocolate with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, we all knew the truth. Something had lured us off the trail deliberately, something that wanted, what? To frighten us, to harm us, to warn us? None of us could agree. The events of that night changed us all. Emily never returned to Scouts, and several others dropped out in the following weeks. Sarah and I stayed, but we never again participated in night hikes. Our silly argument was forgotten, replaced by a bond forged in shared terror. Over the years, I've researched similar incidents in the Wicklow Mountains. There are other stories, though most people are reluctant to share them. A hiker who encountered something impossible on a solo trek. A camping group that packed up and left in the middle of the night, leaving most of their gear behind. A photographer who captured something in the background of a landscape shot that made him destroy the entire memory card. The Lady of Larch Hill legend has evolved. Younger Scouts now tell stories about the night our troop encountered something in the woods. Like all good ghost stories, the details change with each telling, but the core truth remains. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly understand about the dark places of the earth. It's been 10 years since that night, but I still dream about it. In my dreams, I'm running through those dark woods again, but sometimes I stop and turn around, trying to understand what was chasing us. I always wake up before I see its face clearly. Sarah and I remained close friends through university, bonded by our shared experience. We've tried to make sense of what happened, exploring various theories from the scientific to the supernatural. But in the end, we've had to accept that some questions don't have satisfying answers. I still hike and camp. You can't let fear rule your life, but never alone, and never at night. I've returned to Larch Hill several times during daylight hours. The place looks different now. The Welcome Center has been renovated, new trails have been marked, and solar-powered lights illuminate the main paths after dark. But sometimes, standing at the edge of those woods, I hear a faint humming on the wind. And I know that whatever we encountered that night is still there, waiting in the darkness between the trees, between what we know and what we fear to know. The Lady of Larch Hill may have been just a story we told around campfires, but something far more ancient and mysterious dwells in those woods. It was there long before us, and it will remain long after we're gone. A guardian or a predator, or perhaps something we humans simply lack the capacity to understand. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but I'll never forget the night that showed me how thin the boundary is between our orderly, rational world and the mysteries that lurk just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting melody in my dreams, calling me back to the darkness of Larch Hill. The forest was always quiet this time of year. That's why I liked it. I'd been working as a park ranger for about 8 years now, mainly out here in the thick woods of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. The visitors were few and far between, and that suited me just fine. I wasn't one for small talk or chit-chat. The solitude was why I took this job in the first place. My name's Ethan McAllister, and my path to becoming a ranger wasn't exactly straightforward. Before this gig, I spent 7 grueling years working construction in Tulsa. Those years took their toll. Too many late nights bent over blueprints, too many angry bosses breathing down my neck, too many beers to chase away the frustration. The work itself wasn't bad, but the lifestyle was killing me slowly. My doctor had started throwing around words like pre-hypertensive and stress-related symptoms. I needed a change. The ranger position came up almost by accident. I was browsing job listings one night, 3 beers deep, when I saw the posting. They wanted someone with experience in maintaining structures, dealing with harsh weather conditions, and working independently. Construction had taught me all that and more. I applied without much hope, but 2 weeks later I was trading in my hard hat for a ranger's uniform. That was 8 years ago. The job gave me peace, at least until recently. The events I'm about to describe happened just last month, and I've spent every day since then questioning everything I thought I knew about these woods and the creatures that call them home. The morning started like any other. My shift began at dawn, temperature hovering around 45 degrees with a hint of fog rolling through the valleys. I grabbed my gear, standard issue radio, first aid kit, GPS unit, and the .45 I'd been carrying since day one. Some of the newer rangers gave me grief about the gun, said it was overkill for park duty, but I'd seen enough in these woods to know better. Black bears, mountain lions, the occasional rabid coyote. Sometimes you need more stopping power than a can of pepper spray. The air was crisp, almost sharp in my lungs as I started my rounds. The dampness of the morning dew clung to my boots, leaving dark prints on the trail behind me. I headed toward my favorite section of the park, a secluded area known as Pine Hollow. It was remote enough that we rarely saw visitors there, which made it perfect for wildlife observation. The thick canopy of old-growth pines created a permanent twilight beneath their branches, and normally, the place was teeming with life. But not that morning. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. In 8 years of ranger work, I'd learned to read the forest like a book. Every sound, every movement told a story. That morning the story was wrong. No birds calling their morning songs, no squirrels chattering in the branches. Even the insects seemed quieter than usual. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. After all, there could be natural explanations. A predator passing through could silence the woodland creatures. But as I approached the old fire pit, a spot that hadn't seen use in months, the wrongness intensified. The ground around the pit was torn up, but not in any way I'd seen before. Deep gouges raked through the soil, too large for a bear, too deliberate for normal animal behavior. The marks were fresh, probably from the night before, and they formed an almost circular pattern around the pit. But it was the depth that troubled me most. Whatever had made these marks had incredible strength. The gouges were nearly 8 inches deep in places, cutting through roots as thick as my wrist. The trees told an even more disturbing story. Massive claw marks scored the bark, some as high as 12 feet up the trunk. I'd seen bear markings before, hell, I'd documented hundreds of them over the years. These were different. The spacing was wrong, too wide for any animal native to these mountains. And the pattern. Bears marked trees in vertical strips. These marks curved and intersected, almost like something had been trying to climb the trees sideways. I crouched down to examine one of the lower marks, pulling out my phone to document the damage. The photos would be important later, though at the time I was just following protocol. As I framed the shot, a sharp crack echoed through the trees to my left, like a thick branch snapping under considerable weight. My hand moved to the .45 before my conscious mind caught up. 15 years of construction work and 8 years as a ranger had taught me to trust my instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I moved toward the sound, keeping low and stepping carefully to minimize noise. The forest floor was damp enough to muffle my footsteps, but the undergrowth was dense here. Every few steps, a twig would crack or leaves would rustle, sounds that seemed deafening in the unnatural silence. The first glimpse I caught of the creature was just a blur of movement through the trees. Something big, much bigger than a bear, moving with a speed that didn't match its size. The motion was fluid but wrong somehow, like watching a film played at slightly the wrong speed. I followed, keeping my distance, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. When I reached a small clearing, I finally got a clear view, and my world shifted on its axis. The creature stood at the far edge of the clearing, its back toward me. Even hunched over, it had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, coarse fur that seemed to shift between dark brown and gray depending on how the filtered sunlight hit it. But it wasn't the size or the fur that made my blood run cold. It was the way it was put together. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken parts from different animals and forced them together without understanding how bodies are supposed to work. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. The back legs bent like a wolf's, but with an extra joint halfway up the thigh. Its arms, if you could call them that, hung almost to the ground, ending in massive paws with claws that looked more like black daggers than natural appendages. I had my .45 drawn, but I didn't fire. 8 years of ranger training kicked in. You don't shoot unless you're absolutely certain of your target and what's beyond it. But more than that, some primal part of my brain was afraid that bullets wouldn't be enough. That shooting would just make it angry. Then it turned around. I've spent weeks trying to find the right words to describe what I saw, but language fails me. The closest I can come is to say it had a face like a nightmare's interpretation of a wolf. The snout was too long, too wide, filled with yellowed teeth that didn't fit together properly. Some curved outward over its lips, others seemed to grow at random angles. But it was the eyes that haunted me. Pitch black and somehow intelligent, with none of the animal vacancy you see in a wolf or bear. These eyes knew things. They recognized me not as prey or predator, but as something else entirely. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. My finger rested on the trigger, but I couldn't make myself squeeze it. The creature's head tilted slightly, almost curiously, and then it moved. The speed was impossible. One moment it was across the clearing, the next it was gone, vanishing into the trees to my right with a fluidity that defied physics. The movement left me disoriented, my brain struggling to process what I'd just seen. But then I heard the scream. It was human, high-pitched and terrified, coming from the direction the creature had gone. Training took over, and I ran toward the sound, pushing through branches and undergrowth, no longer caring about the noise I made. I came upon another clearing, this one smaller, and immediately wished I hadn't. A young couple, probably college students, stood frozen in horror, staring at what remained of their friend. The victim, male, maybe early 20s, lay sprawled on the ground between them. His chest cavity had been torn open with surgical precision, ribs splayed outward like the petals of some grotesque flower. Internal organs lay scattered across the forest floor, some still connected by strands of tissue, others completely separated from the body. The couple noticed me and ran over, the girl crying hysterically, the guy trying to form coherent sentences through his shock. I positioned myself between them and their friend's body, my gun still drawn, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The girl managed to choke out that they'd been camping, illegally, in an undesignated area, when the thing had attacked without warning. I was about to radio for backup when I heard it, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The noise was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The creature emerged from the shadows with that same impossible speed, but this time it didn't run. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those terrible, intelligent eyes. Blood matted the fur around its mouth, and pieces of flesh clung to its claws. The couple behind me whimpered, and I could feel them pressing closer to my back. What happened next took maybe 5 seconds, but I'll remember it for the rest of my life. The creature charged, moving in that fluid, wrong way that defied natural movement. I fired 3 times, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The first 2 bullets hit it in the chest, punching through fur and flesh. The third caught it in the head, just below one of those black eyes. The creature stumbled, its charge interrupted, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed confused, like it couldn't understand what had happened. Dark blood oozed from the wounds, but it was too thick, too dark to be normal blood. The thing swayed on its feet, those wrong joints bending in impossible ways as it tried to maintain balance. Then finally, it collapsed. The impact when it hit the ground shook leaves from the nearby trees. We all stood there, frozen, waiting to see if it would get up again. It didn't. The only movement was a slight twitching of its limbs, and even that stopped after a few minutes. I kept my gun trained on it while I called for backup on my radio. Within 20 minutes, the clearing was swarming with park rangers and local law enforcement. The sheriff himself showed up, took one look at the creature, and went white as a sheet. I gave my statement 3 times to 3 different people, each time sticking to the facts, leaving out my more subjective observations about the intelligence in its eyes or the wrongness of its movement. The couple was escorted back to the ranger station for their own statements. The girl couldn't stop crying, and the guy looked like he'd aged 10 years in the space of an hour. I never saw them again after that day, but I sometimes wonder how they're coping with what they saw. As for the creature's body, it was loaded into an unmarked van by people who showed up in dark suits and refused to identify themselves beyond vague mentions of a research facility. Before they took it away, I got one last look at it in the daylight. Something about it seemed different in death. Less wrong somehow, as if whatever had animated it and made it so unnatural had fled when it died. The official report lists the incident as an animal attack, probably a bear, with the actual creature's body being classified as an unknown species requiring further study. The victim's death was ruled as a wildlife-related fatality, and the case was closed. But I know what I saw. I still work these woods, but things are different now. I carry extra ammunition. I don't patrol alone if I can help it. And I pay attention to the silence, because sometimes, late at night when I'm making my rounds, I hear that rattling sound in the distance, and I wonder if what I killed that day was the only one of its kind. The forest is quiet this time of year, maybe too quiet. I've always been a city person. The constant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the comforting anonymity of urban life. These were the things I knew and loved. But a few times a year, I'd feel this inexplicable urge to get away from it all. Not your typical beach vacation or resort getaway, mind you. I'm talking about disappearing into the wilderness, finding some secluded cabin rental, and spending a week completely off the grid. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if those trips were some kind of twisted fate. Was I unknowingly drawn to something out there in the dark, or was it drawn to me? These questions have haunted me ever since that fateful week in the Ozarks, a trip that would forever change my perception of reality and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late October, about 3 years ago. I had just wrapped up a grueling project at work, and the need to escape was stronger than ever. I spent hours poring over rental listings, searching for something truly remote. That's when I stumbled upon it. A converted fire tower deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, right in the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains. The listing promised complete solitude, a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness, and absolutely no modern amenities beyond the bare essentials. It was perfect. I booked it immediately, requested time off work, and started planning my trip with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. The drive from St. Louis took nearly 4 hours, the last hour of which was on winding back roads that seemed to get narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. My phone lost signal about 45 minutes before I reached my destination, and I found myself relying solely on the printed directions the owner had provided. As I navigated the final stretch of gravel road, the dense forest suddenly gave way to a small clearing, and there it was, my home for the next week. The fire tower stood about 60 feet tall, a weathered wooden structure that looked like it had been there for decades. A narrow staircase zigzagged up its side, leading to a small cabin perched at the top. I parked my car and took a moment to stretch, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The silence was almost overwhelming after hours of highway noise. No cars, no planes overhead, not even the distant bark of a dog. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird I couldn't identify. Grabbing my backpack and a couple of supply boxes, I made my way up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and I found myself gripping the railing a little tighter as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were burning, and I was slightly out of breath. Note to self: city life hasn't been kind to my fitness level. The cabin itself was simple but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a propane stove and a cooler that served as a makeshift refrigerator. A narrow bed was tucked against the opposite wall, and a rickety table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. But the real star of the show was the view. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire cabin, offering an unobstructed panorama of the surrounding Ozark wilderness. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of autumn colors stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, I could make out the silvery ribbon of a river winding its way through the valley. As I unpacked and settled in, I felt the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no phone calls, no deadlines. Just me, my books, and the great outdoors. The sun was setting by the time I finished organizing my supplies. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and stepped out onto the small balcony that wrapped around the cabin. The view was, in a word, breathtaking. The fading sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the landscape below. But as I stood there, taking in the beauty of it all, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the natural apprehension of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Yet as the light continued to fade and the shadows deepened, the feeling only intensified. It was a sensation I'd never experienced before, a heaviness in the air, a prickling at the back of my neck. I felt watched. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for this irrational fear that was slowly taking hold. But there was nothing, just the gentle swaying of branches in the evening breeze. I shook my head, trying to clear these thoughts. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "You're just not used to being this isolated. It's perfectly normal to feel a little on edge." Forcing myself to relax, I finished my beer and headed back inside. I heated up a simple dinner of canned soup and settled in with one of the books I'd brought along. But even as I tried to lose myself in the pages, I couldn't help glancing up at the windows every few minutes, peering into the darkness beyond. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the tower in the wind, every rustle from the forest below had me jolting awake. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shapeless shadows and glowing eyes watching me from just beyond the firelight. I awoke the next morning feeling groggy and unrested. The early morning sun was streaming through the windows, and I could hear birds chirping cheerfully outside. In the light of day, my fears from the previous evening seemed silly and overblown. I chalked it up to first-night jitters and resolved to make the most of my day. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I decided to explore the area around the tower. There was a trail map pinned to the wall, showing a network of hiking paths crisscrossing the surrounding hills. One trail in particular caught my eye. It led to the top of a nearby ridge that promised even more spectacular views of the valley. I packed a small day pack with water, some snacks, and a first aid kit. As an afterthought, I also grabbed the can of bear spray I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, right? With one last glance at the map, I headed down the tower stairs and set off into the woods. The trail started off easy enough, winding through stands of oak and hickory trees. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, creating a satisfying crunch beneath my boots with each step. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying vegetation, that distinct autumn smell that always filled me with a sense of nostalgia. As I hiked, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the trail. The paranoia from the night before faded away, replaced by a growing appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding me. I stopped occasionally to examine interesting plants or rock formations, snapping photos with my camera to document the journey. It was during one of these stops, about an hour into my hike, that I first noticed something off. I had paused to retie my bootlace when a flash of movement caught my eye. It was just at the edge of my peripheral vision, gone almost as soon as I registered it. I straightened up quickly, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Probably just a deer," I murmured, trying to convince myself. But the uneasy feeling from the night before had returned, settling like a cold weight in my stomach. I pressed on, but now I found myself hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every snapping twig or rustling bush had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to notice other things. There were broken branches along the trail, snapped at a height that seemed too tall for a deer. In a few places, I spotted tufts of coarse, dark fur caught on thorny bushes. And then there was the smell, a musky animal odor that reminded me of a poorly maintained zoo enclosure. It would hit me in waves. growing stronger in some areas before fading away again. By the time I reached the base of the final climb to the ridge, my nerves were thoroughly frayed. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything I'd seen and smelled. But another part, a more primal instinct, was screaming at me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. I stood there for several long moments, debating whether to continue or head back to the relative safety of the fire tower. In the end, stubbornness won out. I'd come this far, and I was determined to see the view from the top of the ridge. Besides, whatever was out here, if there even was anything, surely wouldn't approach me in broad daylight, right? The final ascent was steep and challenging, requiring me to scramble over boulders and pull myself up using exposed tree roots in some places. By the time I reached the summit, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my legs were trembling from exertion. But oh, that view. It was even more spectacular than I had imagined. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. The Ozark Mountains rolled away to the horizon, a sea of reds, oranges, and golds, punctuated by the occasional evergreen. Far below, I could make out the glint of sunlight on water, probably the same river I'd spotted from the fire tower. I found a flat rock to sit on and pulled out my water bottle and a granola bar. As I sat there, catching my breath and taking in the breathtaking scenery, I felt my earlier fears begin to dissipate. How could I be afraid in a place of such incredible beauty? But then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape moving in the valley far below, barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. I might not have even noticed it if not for the way it moved, in a bounding, loping gait that was unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I fumbled for my camera, zooming in as far as the lens would allow. Through the viewfinder, I could make out more details, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. The creature was massive, easily the size of a bear, but its proportions were all wrong. It seemed to shift between moving on all fours and rising up on two legs, its movements fluid and unnaturally quick for something of its size. As I watched, frozen in a mix of fascination and terror, the creature paused. And then, with a deliberate slowness that made my blood run cold, it turned its head and looked directly up at me. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes, two pinpricks of reflected light that seemed to bore into my very soul. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this thing, whatever it was aware of me. Had been aware of me, perhaps, since the moment I'd entered its territory. The spell was broken by the sound of my camera clattering to the ground. I hadn't even realized I'd dropped it. That small noise was enough to snap me back to reality, and suddenly, the only thought in my mind was escape. I scrambled to my feet, leaving my backpack and camera behind in my haste. The sun was now dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. How long had I been sitting there, transfixed by that thing? I'd lost all track of time, and now I was facing a treacherous descent in rapidly fading light. I half ran, half slid down the steep trail, my hands and knees getting scraped and bruised as I stumbled over rocks and roots. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me convinced that the creature was right behind me, ready to pounce at any moment. About halfway down, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that bypassed all rational thought and struck directly at the most primitive part of my brain. "Run," it said. "Run or die." I don't remember much of the rest of that descent. It's all a blur of panic and adrenaline, of branches whipping at my face, and the constant, overwhelming certainty that I was being pursued. At some point, I veered off the main trail, crashing blindly through the underbrush in what I hoped was the general direction of the fire tower. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. There, looming out of the gathering darkness, was an old shed. Without a second thought, I yanked open the weathered door and threw myself inside, pulling it shut behind me. The interior of the shed was pitch black and smelled of mold and decay. I huddled in a corner, trying to quiet my ragged breathing as I strained to listen for any sound of pursuit. Minutes ticked by, then hours. The temperature dropped, and I began to shiver uncontrollably, both from cold and residual fear. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the cracks in the shed's walls. My whole body ached and my mouth was parched with thirst, but I was alive. With trembling hands, I eased the shed door open and peered outside. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror from the night before. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I oriented myself using the position of the sun and set off at a brisk pace in what I hoped was the direction of the fire tower. It took nearly 2 hours of walking before I finally spotted the familiar silhouette of the tower through the trees. I've never been so relieved to see anything in my life. I practically ran the last 100 yards, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite my exhaustion. Once inside, I locked the door, pulled down all the blinds, and collapsed onto the bed. I wanted nothing more than to sleep for days, to pretend that none of this had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there in those woods, it knew where I was, and I had no intention of being here when night fell again. I packed my belongings in record time, leaving behind anything non-essential to speed up my departure. As I was doing a final sweep of the cabin, my eyes fell on the trail map pinned to the wall. On an impulse, I tore it down and stuffed it into my pocket. I'm not sure why. Maybe as proof that this place was real, that I hadn't imagined it all. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I didn't truly relax until I saw the Welcome to St. Louis sign, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. An awareness of something that I was never meant to know existed. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself, or some kind of large wolf. The human mind can play tricks, especially in unfamiliar and stressful situations. But deep down, I knew these explanations were lies I was telling myself to maintain my sanity. I couldn't resist the urge to dig deeper. I spent hours online searching for any information about strange sightings or encounters in the Ozarks. Most of what I found was clearly exaggerated folklore or outright hoaxes. But buried in old newspaper archives and obscure forums, I started to see a pattern. There were reports, stretching back decades, of hikers and campers going missing in that area. Most were written off as tragic accidents, people getting lost or falling victim to the harsh terrain. But some accounts mentioned strange noises in the night, unexplained tracks, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. One story in particular caught my attention. It was from a local paper, dated just a few weeks after my own encounter. A body had been found in the woods, not far from where I'd stayed. The article was light on details, but it mentioned that the victim had been torn to shreds by an unknown animal. The authorities were baffled, saying the wounds didn't match any known predator in the area. As I read account after account, a name kept coming up in hushed whispers and cautious speculation: the Ozark Howler. According to local legend, it was some kind of wolf-like creature that had been haunting the hills for generations. Most dismissed it as a campfire story, a way to explain the inexplicable sounds and sights of the deep woods. But I knew better. What I'd seen was no legend, no trick of the light or overactive imagination. It was real, and it was still out there. I tried to put it all behind me, to go back to my normal life. For a while, it seemed to work. I threw myself into my job, started going out more, doing anything to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of that night in the Ozark KS never truly faded. They lingered at the edges of my consciousness, creeping into my dreams and coloring my perception of the world around me. Months passed, and I started to feel like I was finally regaining some semblance of normalcy. I still avoided camping or hiking, but I could at least walk through the park without constantly looking over my shoulder. I even started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had blown the whole incident out of proportion. That illusion of safety was shattered one crisp autumn night, almost exactly a year after my encounter in the Ozarks. I was working late, the office long since emptied of my co-workers. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced out the window of my 10th floor office. The city sprawled out below, a sea of twinkling lights and shadowy skyscrapers. It was a view I'd seen 1,000 times before, but something about it made me pause. There, on the roof of the building across the street, was a dark shape. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance worker, or perhaps some equipment I'd never noticed before. But then it moved. My blood ran cold as I watched the creature lope across the rooftop with that same unnatural gait I remembered from the forest. It paused at the edge of the building, and even from this distance, I could see the gleam of its eyes as it turned to look directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in the middle of the city. I was safe here, wasn't I? With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. But what could I say? That I'd seen a monster on a rooftop? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I ended the call before it connected and instead snapped a quick picture through the window. The image was blurry and dark, but I could just make out a vague shape on the distant rooftop. I practically ran to my car, constantly checking over my shoulder. The drive home was a nightmare of paranoia, every shadow and movement in my periphery setting my nerves on edge. Once home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and huddled on my couch with all the lights on. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night researching, trying to find any explanation for what I'd seen. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure cryptozoology forum. Most of the posts were the usual Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster theories, but buried in the archives was a thread about the Ozark Howler. As I read through the accounts, my blood ran cold. Several people claimed to have encountered the creature far from its usual hunting grounds. There were reports from Kansas City, from Chicago, even one from as far as Detroit. All described the same thing, a large wolf-like creature spotted in urban areas, always at night, always watching. One post in particular caught my attention. The user, who went by the handle Ozark Survivor, claimed to have had an encounter similar to mine. They too had seen the creature first in the woods, then later in their home city. But their story didn't end there. According to Ozark Survivor, the creature had continued to stalk them. It would appear sporadically, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes on distant rooftops, sometimes in shadowy alleys, once even on the balcony of their high-rise apartment. The post ended abruptly, with no further updates from the user. As dawn broke, I was still on the forum, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The rational part of my brain insisted that it was all nonsense, just urban legends and overactive imaginations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth hidden in these stories. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with researching the Ozark Howler and similar cryptid sightings. I started carrying a high-quality camera with me everywhere, hoping to capture proof if I saw the creature again. I installed security cameras around my apartment and found myself checking the footage compulsively. My work began to suffer. I was constantly exhausted, jumping at every shadow. Friends started to comment on my appearance, asking if everything was okay. I brushed off their concerns, unable to explain the terror that had taken over my life. Then, about a month after the rooftop sighting, it happened again. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I'd hoped never to hear again. That low, rumbling growl that bypassed all rational thought and struck terror into the deepest part of my being. With a trembling hand, I reached for the bedside lamp. As light flooded the room, I saw it. There, on my 10th floor balcony, was the creature. It was pressed against the glass door, its massive form blocking out the city lights behind it. I could see it clearly now, in a way I never had before. Its body was a mass of corded muscle covered in thick, dark fur. Its head was wolf-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The snout too long, the eyes too intelligent. Those eyes, they stared at me with an awareness that was terrifyingly human. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen in my bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature just watched me, its hot breath fogging the glass. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive paw and placed it against the balcony door. The glass creaked under the pressure, and I saw hairline cracks begin to spread from beneath its claws. That was enough to break me from my paralysis. I lunged for my phone, fumbling to unlock it and open the camera app. But by the time I looked back up, the balcony was empty. The creature had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only the cracked glass and a lingering sense of dread. The photo I managed to take showed nothing but an empty balcony. The only evidence of my encounter was the damaged door, and even that could be explained away by natural causes. A stress fracture in the glass, perhaps, or damage from a hailstorm I didn't remember. In the days that followed, I barely slept. I spent my nights huddled in my living room, all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the building settling. During the day, I wandered through life in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The creature, whatever it was, had followed me home. It knew where I lived, and it was toying with me. Each appearance felt like a message. You can't escape. I'm always watching. In desperation, I reached out to Ozark Survivor through the forum. To my surprise, I received a response almost immediately. The message was brief, but it chilled me to my core. It won't stop. It never stops. The only way out is to go back, face it where it all began. I knew what I had to do. A week later, I found myself driving back into the Ozarks. I had taken a leave of absence from work, citing mental health reasons. It wasn't far from the truth. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. This time I came prepared. I had camping gear, emergency supplies, and a high-powered rifle I'd purchased specifically for this trip. I didn't know if it would be effective against the creature, but it made me feel a little less helpless. I set up camp near the fire tower where my nightmare had begun a year ago. As night fell, I built a large fire and waited. Part of me hoped that nothing would happen, that I'd spend a quiet night in the woods and return home, writing off my experiences as an extended, stress-induced hallucination. But as the moon rose over the trees, I heard it. That familiar growl, closer than ever before. I gripped my rifle tightly, my palms sweaty despite the cool night air. It emerged from the shadows at the edge of my campsite. In the flickering firelight, it looked even more terrifying than I remembered. Its eyes reflected the flames, giving them a hellish glow. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could feel its gaze boring into me, filled with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a mere animal. Slowly, I raised my rifle. The creature didn't move. It just watched me, almost seeming curious. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. It wasn't hunting me. It never had been. This creature, this impossibility, was studying me. Just as I had been fascinated by it, venturing into its territory out of a desire to unplug and experience something beyond my normal life, it had become fascinated by me. It had followed me back to the city not out of malice, but out of a desire to understand. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking. "What are you?" I whispered. The creature tilted its head almost quizzically. Then, to my utter astonishment, it sat back on its haunches, much like a dog might. But the intelligence in its eyes was anything but canine. Slowly, cautiously, I sank down to sit by my fire. The creature remained where it was, just watching. And so we stayed, human and monster, regarding each other across the flames. I'd like to say that this realization solved everything, that the creature and I came to some sort of understanding, that my fear vanished and was replaced by wonder. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I spent that entire night in a state of hyper-alertness, my hand never far from my rifle. When dawn finally broke, the creature slunk back into the forest, leaving me alone and exhausted. I packed up my camp with shaking hands and drove home. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with what had happened. I never saw the creature in the city again, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. I've spent the years since then trying to understand what happened to me. I've reached out to cryptozoologists, to folklorists, even to a few open-minded biologists. Most dismiss my story outright. A few listen with interest, but can offer no explanations. I've returned to the Ozarks a few times since then. I never see the creature directly, but sometimes, in the deepest parts of the night, I hear that growl in the distance. And I know it's out there, watching, learning. I don't know what the Ozark howler is. An undiscovered species? Some kind of paranormal entity? A government experiment gone wrong? I have theories, but no real answers. What I do know is this: there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk at the edges of our reality, challenging everything we think we know about the natural world. And sometimes, when we venture into the wilderness seeking to unplug from our modern lives, we attract the attention of these things. So the next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, well, maybe you are. And maybe, just maybe, the watcher is as curious about you as you are about it. Just be careful. Not all curiosity is benign, and some things once seen can never be unseen. My name is Thomas Wilson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September 2001. I've never spoken of this before, and I don't consider myself a storyteller, but I have a feeling you won't believe me anyway, so here goes. I work for a clandestine government organization that specializes in hunting monsters. You won't find any information about us online, and that's by design. If word of our existence ever got out, well, let's just say you might find some men in black suits knocking on your door at midnight. Our team has a code name: Shadow Hunters. I'm the reconnaissance specialist. My job is to scout, analyze, and report back. We were summoned to a national forest in Oregon after a series of unexplained disappearances. At first glance, it seemed like a routine missing persons case. Hikers and campers vanishing without a trace. No bodies, no evidence. The locals blamed it on bears and mountain lions, which made sense on the surface. But the frequency of the disappearances over such a short period raised red flags. Then came the disturbing evidence that pushed this case into our territory. Photographs surfaced, blurry but unmistakable. They showed a massive dark figure hunched over what was clearly not a pile of leaves. The entity was humanoid but impossibly tall, towering over any professional basketball player, with a build that suggested immense strength. Those photos were what brought us in. We arrived at the forest under the cover of darkness. Our team consisted of 4 members: Rodriguez, our muscle and a bit of a hothead; Chen, our tech expert and the brains of the operation; Dr. Patel, our medic and probably the only reason I'm alive to tell this tale; and myself, Thomas Wilson, the eyes and ears of the team. We set up our base camp near a secluded trailhead. The night was unnaturally warm, even for late summer. There was an eerie stillness in the air that set my nerves on edge. We took turns keeping watch, 2 on duty while the other 2 rested. Dr. Patel and I took the first shift. Hours passed uneventfully, with only the usual forest sounds breaking the silence. Around 2 a.m. we handed off to Chen and Rodriguez. I had just drifted off to sleep when a blood-curdling scream jolted me awake. It was Rodriguez, his voice filled with raw terror. I grabbed my rifle, Dr. Patel right beside me. We burst out of the tent to find Chen missing. His sleeping bag was torn open, a single drag mark in the dirt leading into the dense undergrowth. A low primal growl echoed from the darkness. It wasn't a sound I recognized from any known animal. Dr. Patel raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. For a split second, we saw them, 2 massive reflective eyes staring back at us. "Dear God," Dr. Patel whispered. It was just a glimpse before the thing retreated into the shadows, but its outline was all wrong. The arms and legs were too long, its gait a loping stride that spoke of unnatural power and speed. Rodriguez was still screaming Chen's name, his voice growing hoarse. We pulled him back towards the tent, trying to regroup. "We have to go after him," Rodriguez snarled, shaking us off. "No," I said firmly. "We call this in and wait for backup." "And let that thing pick us off one by one?" Rodriguez shouted. He had a point, but I wasn't about to throw our lives away on a suicide mission. I grabbed the radio, but all we got was static. Our equipment was jammed somehow. "It knows," Dr. Patel said, his eyes wide with realization. He wasn't wrong. As daybreak painted the forest in sickly hues, we felt exposed and vulnerable. We decided to head back to the main road, hoping to reach higher ground where we might catch a signal. We didn't make it far. There was a clearing just at the edge of the tree line. In its center, Chen hung suspended 10 feet off the ground, impaled through the chest on a massive wooden spike jutting from the earth. It was fresh wood, as if a tree had been ripped out, sharpened, and I turned away, bile rising in my throat. Dr. Patel knelt, hands shaking as he reached for his med kit, though we all knew it was futile. Rodriguez was silent, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "I'm going to kill it," he growled through clenched teeth. We tried to navigate around the clearing, but every path seemed to lead back to its center, as if the forest itself was guiding us towards that grotesque display. The air grew heavier, oppressive. A loud snap echoed through the trees. We spun in circles, rifles raised, adrenaline pounding in our ears. Then a massive shape fell from the canopy, landing between us and the clearing. It was the creature from the night before, in all its terrible glory. A towering giant at least 9 feet tall, it was gaunt and starved-looking, with skin stretched tight over bone. Its face was elongated, almost like a dog's muzzle, filled with razor-sharp fangs. Long, clawed arms hung nearly to its knees. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and opened fire. The bullet slammed into the creature, making it jerk with each impact, but it kept coming. Dr. Patel grabbed my arm and pulled me back. We ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at our faces. The sounds of the creature's relentless pursuit right behind us. Bursts of gunfire from Rodriguez echoed, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. Dr. Patel tripped, and I crashed down with him, tumbling into a ditch. I rolled underneath a tangle of roots and vines, dragging him with me. Silence fell around us. Not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the heavy, watchful silence of a predator. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. "Dr. Patel?" I hissed. A faint groan came from beside me. Relief flooded through me, quickly replaced by guilt. We had abandoned Rodriguez. There was no way he could have survived that encounter. We had to keep moving. I pressed my ear to the ground, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had lost our scent. We spent hours crawling and weaving through the dense undergrowth. The forest felt like it was closing in on us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Finally, we came across a dirt road, the first sign of civilization we had seen in what felt like an eternity. We followed it, hoping it would lead us out of this nightmare. We didn't speak. The weight of Rodriguez's death hung heavy between us. A noise up ahead made my hand tighten on my rifle. Relief washed over me when I saw the headlights of a truck approaching. It slowed as it drew closer, the driver peering out with a puzzled expression. "Hey, fellas," he called, suspicion evident in his voice. "Y'all lost?" We must have been a sight, covered in dirt and scratches, our eyes wild with exhaustion and terror. I managed to explain about the creature, stumbling over the words. It sounded insane even to my own ears. The driver's expression shifted to one of amusement. "Now, I've heard some tall tales in these parts, but that one takes the cake. Bigfoot, aliens, what'll it be next?" It was futile. No one was going to believe us. I thanked him for the ride back into town and refused to answer any more questions. The local sheriff gave us similar treatment, concern mixed with thinly veiled mockery. They thought we were just lost hikers, maybe a little rattled after a cougar scare. Back at headquarters, the debriefing went as expected. Skeptical faces, raised eyebrows. Disbelief hung heavy in the air. We were ordered to take 2 weeks of leave, with mandatory psychological evaluations scheduled. We were branded as the crazy ones, the agents who saw things that didn't exist. We never saw the creature again, but I could feel it, lurking in the shadows of my mind. It had hunted us, played with us, and it could strike again any time, anywhere. It knew who we were. It knew where to find us. For Dr. Patel, the damage was worse than any physical wounds. The nightmares stole his sleep. Whispers from the darkness filled his waking hours. He couldn't shake the image of Chen, the feeling of helplessness, of being trapped. They said it was PTSD, but I knew it was something more. A year later, Dr. Patel took his own life. They cleaned out his locker, sent the standard condolences to his next of kin. Life at the base moved on as if he'd never existed. I'm still with the team 10 years later. We hunt the things the rest of the world doesn't believe in, the things the government knows damn well are real, even if they'll never admit it publicly. And every night when I close my eyes, I see that clearing. Chen hanging lifeless, Rodriguez's roar of defiance, and the creature's unblinking eyes staring out at us from the darkness. Rodriguez had been right. We were hunted, marked. Survivors? No. We were the living dead. Our lives reduced to a countdown to the next encounter with the unknown. And the nightmares? They never really end. You just learn to live with them, constant companions reminding you that the darkness is vast, and the monsters lurking within are very real. Sometimes I wonder if they put us on leave on purpose back then. Did they already know about the creature's tendencies? Were we an experiment all along? A test to see how long we would last? How much we could endure before we broke? Those thoughts are the most terrifying of all. They hint at a truth far more disturbing than any monster lurking in the woods. That the shadows we fight might just be a part of us, a darkness cultivated and unleashed by the very organization sworn to protect humanity. As I sit here, an old man now, I can't help but feel that my time is running out. The creature is patient, but it never forgets. One day, it will come for me, as it came for Chen and Rodriguez. And when it does, will anyone believe my story? Or will I simply become another mysterious disappearance, another tale whispered around campfires? Remember this, dear reader. The forests hold secrets darker than you can imagine. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones who send us to face them, knowing full well what awaits in the dark. As the miles rolled by and the forest receded behind us, I found myself wondering if I would ever truly escape what I'd experienced in those woods. The old man driving the car, who had introduced himself as Frank, kept glancing at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You want to tell me what happened back there, son?" he asked after we'd been driving for about 20 minutes. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I'd lived through it. I was staying at a cabin in the woods, I began hesitantly. Things started happening. Strange things. I heard noises, saw things that shouldn't exist. And then tonight, I thought I heard my cousin calling for help. But it wasn't him. It was something else. I expected Frank to laugh, to tell me I must have been dreaming or hallucinating. But he just nodded slowly, his weathered face grave in the dim light of the dashboard. "Pisgah's got its secrets," he said after a long pause. "Been living in these parts all my life, and there's things in those woods that don't fit into any natural history book, if you know what I mean." A chill ran down my spine. "You've seen something too?" Frank shook his head. "Not me personally, but I've heard stories. Folks going missing, strange lights in the sky, animals acting peculiar. Most people write it off as tall tales or superstition, but you've got the look of a man who's seen something he can't explain away." We lapsed into silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. As the adrenaline of my escape began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Frank was gently shaking my shoulder. "We're here, son," he said. I blinked, disoriented. We were parked outside a small diner, its neon sign a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Brevard," Frank replied. "Figured you could use some food and coffee, and there's a motel down the street if you need a place to stay." I nodded gratefully, realizing for the first time how hungry and thirsty I was. As we entered the diner, the smell of coffee and bacon wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. I was safe. I was back in the world of fluorescent lights and Formica tabletops, of tired waitresses and truckers on their early morning routes. As we settled into a booth and placed our orders, Frank leaned across the table, his expression serious. "Listen, son," he said in a low voice. I don't know exactly what you saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to. But let me give you some advice. There's folks around here who've had experiences. They meet up sometimes, talk about what they've seen. Helps to know you're not alone, you know. He scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across to me. They're meeting tonight, if you're interested. I stared at the napkin, conflicting emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted nothing more than to forget everything that had happened, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination and too many nights alone in the woods. But another part of me knew that I'd never be able to forget, never be able to fully convince myself that it hadn't been real. Thanks, I said, pocketing the napkin. I'll think about it. After breakfast, Frank dropped me off at the motel. As I watched his taillights disappear down the street, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this kind stranger who had quite possibly saved my life. In my motel room, I finally allowed myself to relax. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing away the dirt and sweat of my ordeal. As I dried off, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and hardly recognized the haggard, wild-eyed man staring back at me. I spent most of the day sleeping, my body desperately catching up on days of stress and sleepless nights. When I woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. I sat on the edge of the bed, Frank's napkin in my hand, debating what to do next. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I needed answers, or at least the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address Frank had provided. The meeting was held in the back room of a local community center. As I walked in, I was struck by how ordinary everyone looked. There were maybe 24 people of various ages, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups and chatting in low voices. They could have been a book club or a neighborhood watch meeting. But as the meeting got underway and people began to share their stories, I realized I was among kindred spirits. They spoke of strange lights in the sky, of lost time and inexplicable phenomena, and some like me had encountered things in the depths of Pisgah that defied explanation. I listened, my heart pounding, as a woman described an encounter chillingly similar to my own, a voice calling for help, leading her deep into the woods, only to reveal something inhuman and terrifying. When she finished, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup, I found myself standing up. I saw something too, I began hesitantly. And then the words came pouring out, everything I'd experienced over those nightmarish days in the cabin. As I spoke, I saw recognition and understanding in the eyes of those around me. For the first time since my ordeal began, I felt truly heard and believed. After the meeting, several people approached me, offering words of support and sharing their own experiences. One man, a local historian, told me about the long history of strange occurrences in the area, dating back to Native American legends of spirits in the woods. As I left the community center that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The horror of what I'd experienced was still with me, and I knew it always would be. But knowing I wasn't alone, that others had faced similar terrors and survived, gave me a strange sort of peace. In the days that followed, I grappled with what to do next. I couldn't bring myself to return to the cabin to retrieve my belongings, but I did file a report with the local authorities about my experience. They were skeptical, of course, but promised to look into it. I called my cousin from a payphone, relieved to hear his voice and confirm that he was safe. I gave him a sanitized version of events, telling him there had been some trouble at the cabin, and I'd had to leave suddenly. He was concerned and apologetic, but I assured him it wasn't his fault. As for my writing career, well, I finally had a story to tell. Not the novel I'd originally planned, but something far stranger and more terrifying. I began to write, pouring my experiences onto the page, turning my nightmare into a narrative that I hoped might warn others about the dangers lurking in the dark heart of Pisgah. I'm not sure if anyone will believe my story. Most will probably dismiss it as fiction, a horror tale spun from an overactive imagination. But I know the truth, and I know that out there in the depths of the forest, something is waiting, watching, humming its otherworldly song. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the bustling streets of Brevard, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The paranoia began to eat away at me, making it difficult to sleep or concentrate on my writing. I started attending the support group meetings regularly, finding comfort in the shared experiences of others who had encountered the unexplainable. One evening, an elderly man named George approached me after the meeting. His eyes were kind but held a sadness that spoke of a lifetime of carrying a heavy burden. "I've been listening to your story, son," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "And I think it's time I shared mine with you. It might help you understand what you're dealing with." We walked to a nearby diner, and over cups of coffee that grew cold as we talked, George unfolded a tale that chilled me to the bone. He had been a forest ranger in Pisgah National Forest back in the 1970s, and during his time there, he had witnessed things that defied explanation. It wasn't just one incident, George explained, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. It was a series of strange occurrences over the years, animals behaving oddly, as if they were fleeing from some unseen predator, hikers going missing, only to turn up days later with no memory of where they'd been, and the sounds. God, the sounds. He described hearing unearthly wails echoing through the forest at night, sounds that no known animal could make. And then there were the lights, strange pulsating orbs that would appear deep in the woods, hovering just above the treetops before vanishing without a trace. "But the worst was the day I found the cave," George continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was hidden behind a waterfall, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. Inside I found paintings, ancient paintings on the walls that seemed to depict things, creatures that looked almost human but not quite, and symbols, strange symbols that hurt your eyes to look at them for too long." George had reported his findings to his superiors, but they had dismissed his concerns. The cave was written off as an undocumented Native American site, and George was warned not to spread crazy stories that might scare off tourists. "But I knew what I saw," George said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "And I think you've seen it too, or something like it. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's been there for a long, long time, and it's not going anywhere." As I listened to George's story, pieces of my own experience began to fall into place. The strange symbols I'd seen carved into trees near the cabin, the inexplicable sense of dread that had permeated the air. It all suddenly felt like part of something much larger and more ancient than I had realized. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, spending long hours at the local library poring over historical records and folklore of the region. I discovered that the area had a long history of unexplained phenomena, dating back to the earliest European settlers and beyond. Native American legends spoke of a thin place in the forest where the veil between worlds was weak, allowing spirits and otherworldly entities to cross over. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice strange occurrences in my daily life. Books I needed would fall off the shelf just as I reached for them. I'd overhear snippets of conversation that seemed eerily relevant to my investigation. And more than once, I could have sworn I saw the same figure watching me from across the street, only to disappear when I tried to get a closer look. One night, as I was walking back to my motel room after a late dinner, I felt an overwhelming sense of being followed. The street was deserted, the only sound the buzz of the street lights and the distant bark of a dog. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached for my room key, I heard a voice behind me, a voice that sounded exactly like my cousin's. "Hey, need some help?" I spun around, my blood turning to ice in my veins. There, standing under the flickering neon of the motel sign, was a figure that looked exactly like my cousin. But something was off. The smile was too wide, the eyes too blank. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing that wasn't my cousin tilted its head at an impossible angle, its grin stretching even wider. "Are you sure about that?" it asked, its voice distorting into something inhuman. I fumbled with my key, practically falling into my room and slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, lights blazing, jumping at every sound. The next morning I called my cousin again just to hear his voice and reassure myself that he was okay. He answered, groggy with sleep, completely unaware of my terror. I didn't tell him about what I'd seen. How could I? As the weeks turned into months, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from Pisgah and its mysteries as I could. But another part of me felt compelled to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. I began to interview other locals, gathering more stories of strange encounters and unexplained events. Some were reluctant to talk at first, but once they realized I wasn't there to mock or dismiss them, the stories came pouring out. Tales of lost time, of strange creatures glimpsed in the underbrush, of voices calling out in the night. One story in particular stuck with me. An old woman, her face lined with years of hard living, told me about her grandfather's encounter back in the 1930s. He had been a moonshiner, operating a still deep in the woods to avoid the revenuers. One night, as he was tending to his still, he heard music, beautiful otherworldly music that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He said it was like nothing he'd ever heard before, the old woman recounted, her eyes distant with memory. It made him want to follow it, to find its source, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was common sense, but he packed up his still that very night and never went back into those woods again. As I collected these stories, a pattern began to emerge. The encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas of the forest, particularly in the more remote regions where few people ventured. I started mapping out the incidents, creating a web of strangeness that spread across Pisgah like a spider's web. My research led me to an old, nearly forgotten legend about a place deep in the forest known as the Whisper Hollow. According to the stories, it was a place where the boundaries between our world and something else were thin. A place where reality itself seemed to warp and bend. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the Whisper Hollow was the key to understanding what was happening in Pisgah. But finding it wouldn't be easy. The location was shrouded in mystery, with different stories placing it in different parts of the vast forest. I knew I was taking a risk by even considering going back into those woods. The memory of my terrifying experience at the cabin was still fresh in my mind. But I also knew that I would never find peace until I uncovered the truth. So I began to prepare. I bought hiking gear, studied maps of the forest, and even took a wilderness survival course. I also reached out to some of the people I'd met through the support group, asking if anyone would be willing to accompany me on my search for the Whisper Hollow. To my surprise, 3 people volunteered. Maria, a retired teacher who had her own strange encounter in the woods years ago, Dave, a local carpenter with a passion for cryptozoology, and Laura, a young graduate student studying folklore, who was eager to see if there was any truth to the legends. As we planned our expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once I caught glimpses of strange shadows moving at the edge of my vision, or heard whispers just on the edge of hearing. But I tried to push these fears aside, focusing instead on our preparations. The night before we were set to leave, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in a forest clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to loom impossibly tall. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water, so still it looked like black glass. As I approached the pool, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The face looking back at me was ancient, its features constantly shifting and changing. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream lingering like a bad taste in my mouth. As I got ready to meet the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far beyond our understanding. Our journey into Pisgah began on a crisp autumn morning, the trees a riot of red and gold. We had decided to start our search in an area where several of the stories I'd collected seemed to overlap. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of birds and small animals gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. By the 3rd day of our expedition, we had ventured far off the marked trails, relying on our map and compass to navigate the increasingly dense forest. The air felt thick and heavy, as if we were walking through an invisible fog. Maria was the first to notice that our compasses were acting strangely. the needles spinning erratically before settling on a direction that couldn't possibly be north. "I don't like this," Dave muttered, eyeing the surrounding trees warily. "It feels like the forest is watching us." I knew exactly what he meant. There was a palpable sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very ground we walked on. More than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain that I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. The darkness seemed to press in around us, our campfire creating a small island of light in an ocean of shadows. We took turns keeping watch, none of us willing to leave ourselves completely vulnerable to whatever might be out there. It was during my watch in the darkest hours of the night that I first heard it, a faint melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was hauntingly beautiful, and I found myself straining to hear it more clearly. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others if it was just my imagination. But Laura was already sitting up in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide. "I hear it," she said softly. It's like nothing I've ever heard before." As we listened, the humming grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be calling to us, urging us to follow it deeper into the woods. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to get up and walk towards the sound, and I could see the same struggle reflected in Laura's face. Suddenly, Maria bolted upright with a gasp. "No!" she cried out, her voice thick with terror. "Don't listen to it! That's how they get you!" Her shout broke whatever spell the music had cast over us. The humming faded away, leaving behind in silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. None of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning as we broke camp, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We all knew that we had experienced something beyond the ordinary, something that couldn't be easily explained away. "Maybe we should turn back," Dave suggested, his usual enthusiasm noticeably dampened. "We're clearly dealing with forces we don't understand." Part of me agreed with him. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But another part, the part that had been driving me since that night at the cabin, knew that I couldn't turn back now. We were close to something. I could feel it. "We press on," I said, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I felt. "We came here for answers, and I intend to find them." As we continued our journey, the forest around us seemed to change subtly. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. Strange fungi and colors I had never seen before sprouted from the ground and the bark of trees. The air became thick with a sweet, cloying scent that made my head spin. It was Laura who first noticed the symbols. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak, partially obscured by moss and lichen, was a series of intricate designs that looked vaguely like writing, but in no alphabet any of us recognized. "These symbols," Laura breathed, her fingers tracing the carvings. "They're similar to ones found in some ancient Native American sites, but different, older somehow." As we examined the tree more closely, we realized that the symbols weren't just on this one tree. They were everywhere. Once we knew what to look for, we could see them carved into rocks, formed by the patterns of lichen on tree trunks, even seemingly drawn in the very soil beneath our feet. "It's like the whole forest is trying to tell us something," Maria said, her voice hushed with awe and fear. We spent hours documenting the symbols, Laura sketching them in her notebook while I took photographs. The more we looked, the more we found, and soon we realized that the symbols seemed to be forming a path, leading us deeper into the heart of the forest. As we followed this cryptic trail, the world around us seemed to shift and change. Colors became more vibrant, almost painfully so. Shadows moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. More than once I saw things moving just at the edge of my vision, shapes that were almost human, but not quite. The air grew thick with mist, limiting our visibility to just a few feet ahead. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, whispers in a language none of us understood, the cry of birds that shouldn't exist, and always faintly in the background, that haunting, melodic humming. We lost all sense of time as we pressed on. Our watches had stopped working, and the sky above was hidden by a thick canopy of leaves. It could have been hours or days that we walked following the trail of symbols. Finally, we emerged from the mist into a vast clearing. In the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk easily 30 feet in diameter. The bark was covered in the same strange symbols we had been following, but here they seemed to glow with an inner light. At the base of the tree was a pool of water so still it looked like a mirror. The surface reflected not the sky above, but what looked like another forest, a dark, twisted version of the one we stood in. The Whisper Hollow, I breathed, knowing without a doubt that we had found what we were looking for. As we approached the pool, the humming we had heard earlier grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the water itself, calling to us, inviting us closer. Dave reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the pool. "What do you think happens if we touch it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before any of us could answer, a voice spoke from behind us, a voice that sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood, ancient and powerful. "You have come seeking answers," it said, "but are you prepared for the truth?" We turned, and there, emerging from the mist, was a figure that defied description. It seemed to be made of bark and leaves, its form constantly shifting and changing. Eyes like amber pools regarded us with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. "What are you?" Maria gasped, her voice trembling. The being's mouth, if you could call it that, curved into what might have been a smile. "I am the guardian of this place," it said, "the keeper of the boundary between your world and others." As it spoke, the world around us seemed to ripple and shift. I saw glimpses of other realities, worlds of impossible beauty and terrifying darkness, all layered over our own like a complex tapestry. "The veil is thin here," the guardian continued. "What you have experienced, what you have seen in these woods, they are but echoes of what lies beyond. Your kind is not meant to walk between worlds, yet some are drawn here, pulled by forces they cannot understand." I thought of all the stories I had collected, all the strange encounters and inexplicable events. "The missing hikers," I said, "the strange creatures people have seen." The guardian nodded, a slow creaking movement. "Some find their way back, others do not." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the full implications of what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't just about solving a mystery or uncovering a local legend. We were standing at the threshold of something far greater, far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. "Why show yourself to us now?" Laura asked, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. The guardian's form shifted, branches and leaves rearranging themselves into a new configuration. "Because you sought, because you listened, and because the balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker and what lies beyond grows restless." As if in response to its words, the humming from the pool grew louder, more insistent. The surface of the water began to ripple, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving beneath its surface, things that should not, could not exist in our world. "You stand at a crossroads," the guardian said, its voice taking on an urgent tone. "What you do with the knowledge you have gained here will shape the future of both your world and others. Choose wisely." With those words, the guardian began to fade, its form dissolving back into the mist. The humming from the pool reached a fever pitch, and the world around us seemed to waver, as if reality itself was uncertain. In that moment, I knew we had a choice to make. We could turn back, try to forget what we had seen and return to our normal lives. Or we could step forward into the unknown, risking everything to uncover the full truth of what lay beyond the Whisper Hollow. As I looked at my companions, I saw the same mixture of fear and determination in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. Whatever we decided, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting for our decision. The fate of two worlds, perhaps more, hung in the balance. And as the mist swirled around us and the otherworldly music filled the air, I took a deep breath and made my choice. "We need to seal it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't let whatever's on the other side come through." Maria nodded, her face set with determination. "But how?" As if in answer, I felt a weight in my pocket. Reaching in, I pulled out a small, smooth stone, one I didn't remember picking up. It was covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen throughout the forest. Instinctively, I knew what I had to do. I approached the pool, the humming growing almost unbearable. The surface rippled violently, shapes just beneath trying to break through. With a silent prayer, I dropped the stone into the center of the pool. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The humming turned into a shriek that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The pool's surface began to churn and boil, the shapes beneath thrashing in what looked like agony. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Laura's arm and pulling her away from the pool. We fled through the forest, the world around us seeming to warp and twist. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching for us like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet shifted and roiled, making each step a struggle. Behind us, a sound like reality itself tearing apart filled the air. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting as far away from that clearing as possible. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been hours or days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that otherworldly forest. But gradually the sounds of pursuit faded. The trees around us began to look more normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Finally, exhausted and gasping for breath, we stumbled onto a hiking trail. In the distance, we could hear the faint sounds of traffic, civilization. We looked at each other, our faces dirty and scratched, our clothes torn. No words were needed. We all knew that what we had experienced would stay with us forever. As we made our way back to town, I thought about everything we had seen and learned. The Guardian's warning echoed in my mind. The balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker. I knew then that our work wasn't over. We had closed one doorway, but how many others were out there? How many other thin places existed where the veil between worlds could be breached? In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to readjust to normal life. But the memory of our experience in Pisgah haunted us. We stayed in touch, sharing our research and keeping an eye out for any signs that the boundary might be weakening again. I continued my writing, but not the novel I had originally planned. Instead, I began documenting our experiences, encrypting the most sensitive information. I scattered clues throughout my work, breadcrumbs for those who might need this knowledge in the future. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that haunting melody. I see shadows move in ways they shouldn't. And I wonder if we truly succeeded in sealing the breach, or if we only delayed the inevitable. One thing I know for certain, the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. There are forces out there beyond our understanding, entities that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And somewhere, in the depths of Pisgah National Forest, the Whisper Hollow waits. Silent for now, but for how long? Only time will tell. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening, because now I know the truth. The veil is thin, and what lies beyond is always trying to find a way through. And when it does, someone needs to be ready to face it. That someone might just be me.